The case file had no index number. Watson noticed this first, before the smoke, before the acrid sweetness of burning paper, before the expression on Holmes's face that he had never seen in all their years of association. The file was unmarked along its spine, as though it had never been entered into the system of cross-referenced records Holmes maintained with a rigor that bordered, Watson had often thought, on the devotional. Every case had a number. Every number had a place. Holmes's records were not merely organized. They were a monument to the conviction that all of human behavior could be catalogued, retrieved, and understood. This file had been kept outside that monument entirely. Watson had returned late from a dinner of the Medical Society at the Langham, where he had spent an interminable evening listening to Dr. Anstruther expound upon the surgical applications of carbolic spray with all the evangelical fervor of a man who has discovered religion at 60. He had climbed the 17 steps to their sitting room expecting to find Holmes occupied with one of his chemical experiments, or perhaps sprawled across the settee in one of those states of dangerous intellectual vacancy that preceded either a breakthrough or a cocaine bottle. He found neither. Holmes was kneeling before the fireplace, feeding pages into the grate with the slow, deliberate care of a man performing a ritual. Not crumpling them. That would have been temperamental, emotional, the act of a man in a passion. Holmes was placing each sheet flat upon the coals and watching it catch, watching the ink brown and curl before the paper itself surrendered to flame. His back was to the door, and he did not turn at Watson's entrance, though he must certainly have heard it. Holmes. No response. Another page, laid with precision upon the small pyre. Holmes. What on earth are you doing? Close the door, Watson. The voice was level, controlled, and entirely wrong. There was something beneath that control, not agitation, nothing so simple, but a quality Watson recognized from his years in medical practice. He had heard it in the voices of patients who were making decisions about their own care that they knew their physicians would oppose. The voice of someone who has resolved upon a course and does not intend to be dissuaded. Watson did not close the door. He stepped forward instead, and it was only then that Holmes turned. The expression Watson saw stopped him mid-stride. Holmes's gray eyes held no calculation, no sardonic amusement, no intellectual restlessness. They held warning. I asked you to close the door, and I am asking you what you are burning. A private matter. You do not have private matters. You have cases, and you do not burn cases. Something shifted in Holmes's jaw. This is not a case, not any longer. Watson looked past him to the grate. Several pages had already been consumed, their ashes layered and fragile as moth wings. But the file itself, a plain cardboard folder, government buff, slightly foxed at the edges, still held papers. Perhaps a dozen sheets remained. Holmes's left hand rested upon it with a pressure that was, Watson realized, proprietary. Guarding. Stand aside, Watson said. You will leave this room. I will not. The silence that followed was not the familiar silence of two men who understood each other's rhythms. It was the silence of a boundary being tested, a line neither had previously known existed in their friendship now drawn across a hearthrug in a rented room on Baker Street. Watson moved first. He reached for the folder, and Holmes's hand closed around his wrist with a force that shocked them both. For a moment they stood locked, physician and detective. Watson's fingers inches from the cardboard edge. Holmes's grip hard enough to leave marks. Watson could feel the tremor in it, not weakness, not age, but the vibration of a will under extreme internal pressure. Let go, Watson said quietly. Holmes held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then his fingers opened and he turned back to the fire as though Watson had ceased to exist. Watson pulled the folder free. Several loose pages slid from it. He caught them against his chest. He stepped back, breathing harder than the exertion warranted, and looked down at what he held. The topmost page was singed along its right margin. the text partially obliterated by a brown scorch mark that had consumed perhaps a third of the content. But what remained was legible. A name, written in Holmes's precise hand, appeared at the top of the page beside a chemical formula Watson recognized as an alkaloid compound, though the specific identification was lost to the burn. The name was Cathcart. Below it, in a hand that was not Holmes's, a rounder, more cautious script, a single line had been added, underscored twice. The verdict stands. Let it stand. Watson looked up. Holmes had not moved from the fireplace. The last of the burned pages was collapsing into ash, and the light from the coals played across his profile with a warmth that his expression did not share. "Who is Cathcart?" Watson asked. Holmes said nothing. "Holmes, who is Cathcart, and why are you destroying a file you never indexed?" When Holmes finally spoke, his voice carried something Watson would spend the coming days attempting to name. It was not guilt, it was not grief. It sat somewhere between the two, in a territory Watson had not previously believed Holmes capable of inhabiting. "Go to bed, Watson." Watson did not go to bed. He took the surviving pages to his room, locked the door, and read what remained of a case that, by every principle Holmes had ever articulated, should never have been burned at all. The solicitor who would not be turned away. The morning brought no reconciliation. Watson descended to find the sitting room restored to its habitual disorder, papers stacked on every horizontal surface, the chemical apparatus on the deal table bearing evidence of recent use, the breakfast things laid but scarcely touched. Holmes was not present. Mrs. Hudson, when pressed, reported only that Mr. Holmes had gone out before 7 and had offered no indication of his destination or expected return. Watson sat alone with his coffee and the rescued pages. By daylight they yielded less than he had hoped. The scorch damage was extensive. What survived were fragments. The name Cathcart repeated across 3 separate sheets, the partial chemical formula he had noted the previous night, and a series of dates from October 1893, a period Watson recalled only vaguely, for it fell during the years of Holmes's supposed death, when Watson had been grinding through his grief in a Paddington practice, and the world had seemed a duller, smaller mechanism altogether. But Holmes had not been dead in October 1893. He had been alive, abroad, dismantling what remained of Moriarty's network, or so he had later claimed. If these pages documented a case from that period, it was one Holmes had conducted without Watson's knowledge, during the very years Watson had spent mourning him. The thought carried a sting Watson had not anticipated. He was still examining the pages when the bell rang below, and Mrs. Hudson's tread upon the stairs announced a visitor. Watson folded the pages into his breast pocket and rose. The young man who entered the sitting room was perhaps 28, lean, clean-shaven, and dressed with the careful precision of someone for whom appearances were a professional instrument. His coat was good, but not new. His boots had been recently resoled, competently, not expensively. A solicitor, Watson judged, and one in the early years of independent practice, when reputation must be built upon presentation, because it cannot yet rest upon record. "Dr. Watson?" The voice was controlled, but the control was effortful. Watson recognized the particular tension of a man who had rehearsed his opening and was now committing to its delivery. "My name is Edwin Cathcart. I wrote to Mr. Holmes 10 days ago and received no reply. I have come in person because the matter does not permit further delay. Cathcart." Watson's hand moved involuntarily toward his breast pocket. "I am afraid Holmes is not presently at home," Watson said. "Perhaps you might leave your card, and I shall ensure—" "I was told that, Dr. Watson, by your landlady, 3 days ago and again yesterday. I do not believe Mr. Holmes is absent. I believe he is refusing to see me, and I believe you may know why, though it is possible you do not." Edwin Cathcart's composure held, but Watson could see its architecture, the deliberate steadiness of the jaw, the hands kept still by conscious instruction, the gaze that met Watson's with an intensity born not of aggression, but of contained desperation. This was a man who had compressed considerable anguish into the language of professional civility, and the compression was costing him. Watson gestured toward the basket chair. "Sit down, Mr. Cathcart." Edwin sat. He did not remove his gloves. He placed his hat upon his knee, with the brim aligned precisely forward. A small, controlling gesture, the kind Watson observed in patients managing acute distress through the governance of trivial details. "My father was Judge Aldous Cathcart of the Queen's Bench Division," Edwin began. "He died on the 14th of October, 1893, during a recess in a trial he was presiding over, the fraud prosecution of a shipping magnate named Leonard Voss. The official cause of death was cardiac failure. He was 57 years old. He had no history of cardiac weakness. He died alone in a locked chamber within the Royal Courts of Justice, and no inquest was held." Edwin paused, not for effect, for breath. The recitation of fact was costing him more than its clinical surface suggested. "I was 22 when my father died. I accepted the official account because I had no grounds to challenge it and no means to investigate. 2 months ago, my mother passed away. In settling her affairs, I found correspondence she had hidden for 3 years. Among it was a letter, written to my father, dated the 1st of October, 1893, signed by Mr. Sherlock Holmes." From his inner pocket, Edwin produced an envelope. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, and bore Holmes's handwriting. Watson recognized it at once, that angular, rapid script that looked, as he had once privately thought, like the purposeful tracks of a determined bird across unmarked snow. "This letter," Edwin said, placing it on the table between them with the deliberation of a man setting down a weapon he has carried too long, "suggests that Mr. Holmes was aware of a threat to my father's life 2 weeks before the death occurred. It further suggests he investigated the matter afterward." Edwin's composure thinned. "And then, Dr. Watson, this is what has brought me to your doorstep 3 times in as many days. It suggests that he simply stopped." Watson took the letter. Edwin watched, but did not prevent it. The letter was brief. Holmes's correspondence was always brief. He viewed discursiveness in written communication as intellectual cowardice. But this letter's brevity carried a different quality. It was not efficient. It was guarded. "Dear Judge Cathcart," it read, "I write regarding the matter we discussed on the 27th ultimo. I have pursued the line of inquiry you proposed, and arrived at conclusions I am not prepared to commit to paper. I urge you in the strongest terms to alter the arrangements for your private chambers during the Voss proceedings. The current configuration presents vulnerabilities I shall explain when we meet. I expect to call upon you no later than the 5th. Until then, admit no one to your chambers whose presence you have not personally requested. S.H. the 5th of October." 9 days before the judge died, Watson read the letter twice. Then he looked up at Edwin Cathcart, who sat perfectly still in the basket chair, his hat balanced on his knee, his gloves buttoned, his eyes holding the particular brightness of a man who has waited a very long time for someone to take him seriously. "Mr. Cathcart," Watson said carefully, "I must be honest with you. I have no knowledge of this case. The period you describe, the autumn of 1893, was one during which I believed Holmes to be dead. Whatever investigation this letter implies, I was not part of it." "I know," Edwin said. "That is precisely why I am telling you, Dr. Watson, because whatever Mr. Holmes did in 1893, he did it alone. And whatever made him stop, I believe he has never told anyone." Watson felt the weight of the singed pages against his chest. "He wrote to my father warning of danger," Edwin continued. And now the rehearsed composure was fracturing, not dramatically, but in small structural failures, a tightening of the voice, a fractional tremor in the fingers resting on the hat brim. "He identified a threat. He promised to come. And then my father died exactly as the letter predicted he might. I need to know what Mr. Holmes discovered. I need to know why he abandoned the investigation, and I need to know whether the man who killed my father was ever held to account. Watson placed the letter on the table. "Wait here," he said. "I will find Holmes." He did not find Holmes. But Holmes, as was his habit when avoidance had been rendered structurally impossible, found him. What Holmes will not say. Holmes returned at 11:30, entering through the sitting-room door with the particular energy of a man who has been walking hard and thinking harder. He stopped when he saw Edwin Cathcart's card on the mantelpiece, propped against the skull where Watson had placed it with pointed visibility. "He came then," Holmes said. "Not a question. He came. He sat in that chair for 40 minutes and told me about his father. He showed me a letter you wrote to Judge Cathcart in October of 1893, warning of a threat to his life." Watson was standing by the window, arms folded, making no effort to soften the confrontation. "He told me his father died 9 days after you promised to visit. He told me no inquest was held. He told me you investigated, and then you stopped. And I am now telling you, Holmes, that you will explain to me what happened, or I will reconstruct it without your assistance, and you will not enjoy the conclusions I reach independently." Holmes removed his coat. He hung it on the hook behind the door with his customary precision. He crossed to the mantelpiece, picked up Edwin Cathcart's card, and examined it as though it were a specimen, turning it over, running his thumb across the embossed lettering, noting the printer's mark in the lower corner. Watson recognized the performance. It was not deduction. It was delay. "The young man's card stock is from Harrington and Locke on Chancery Lane," Holmes said. "A respectable firm. Modest but not cheap. He has—" "Holmes." The word landed like a closed door. Holmes set down the card. "Sit," Watson said. Holmes did not sit. He stood at the mantelpiece with one hand resting upon it, fingers spread, and for several seconds he looked not at Watson but at the space above the fireplace where the bullet-pocked wall bore the patriotic VR. He had shot into the plaster years ago in a fit of restless boredom. Watson had the sudden, uncomfortable impression that Holmes was not gathering his thoughts, but rather calculating how little he could disclose and still end the conversation. "Aldous Cathcart," Holmes began, "was a Queen's Bench judge of considerable reputation and moderate ability. In September of 1893, during my time abroad, I received through indirect channels a communication from him requesting my confidential assistance regarding irregularities in a case he was preparing to try, the fraud prosecution of Leonard Voss, a shipping magnate with substantial interests in the eastern trade routes. I was in Montpellier at the time. I returned to London covertly." "You were in London," Watson said. "In 1893, while I was—" "Yes." Holmes cut him short, and the single syllable carried an awareness of exactly what Watson had been doing in 1893, grieving, practicing, rebuilding a life around an absence Holmes had manufactured. The word was not an apology. Holmes did not trade an apology. But it was an acknowledgement, and Watson, though the old wound opened briefly, allowed it to pass. "I investigated the irregularities Cathcart described. I identified what I believed to be a credible threat. I wrote to him with precautionary instructions. On the 14th of October, before I could meet with him in person, he died in his locked judicial chamber during the Voss trial recess." "And you investigated the death?" "I did. Alone. Necessarily alone. I was, you will recall, officially dead. I could not engage the police, could not appear as a witness, could not operate through any of the conventional channels. I investigated privately over a period of some weeks, and I arrived at a conclusion." "Which was?" Holmes's hand tightened on the mantelpiece. The knuckles whitened. It was a small thing, a physician's observation, the kind Watson made automatically, but it spoke to a tension in Holmes that no deductive mask could quite conceal. "I identified the man responsible for Cathcart's death. His name was Arthur Denny. He had been a clerk in Leonard Voss's shipping office. He had motive, means, and opportunity, and the physical evidence, a chemical trace upon his clothing, a forged key found in his lodgings, and a witnessed altercation with the judge 2 days prior to the death, was, in my judgment, conclusive. And I arranged for the evidence to reach the appropriate authorities through channels that did not require my visible involvement. Denny was arrested in March of 1894. He was tried at the Old Bailey in June. He was convicted. He was hanged on the 9th of August, 1894. Holmes delivered this sequence with the flat precision of a man reading a railway timetable. Watson waited. He knew, with the instinct of long acquaintance and longer trust, that the essential thing had not yet been said. "The matter was resolved," Holmes said. "The man who killed Aldous Cathcart was identified, tried by a jury of his peers, and executed pursuant to lawful sentence. The case is closed." "Then why?" Watson said. "Were you burning the file?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He looked again at the wall above the fireplace, at the bullet holes that spelled out the initials of a queen whose justice he had spent his career serving, or believed he had, "because I was the one who should have hanged." The words fell into the room without emphasis. Holmes did not raise his voice. He did not turn to face Watson. He delivered the statement to the wall, to the bullet holes, to the plaster and the patriotic vandalism of his younger, more certain self, and then he walked to his bedroom door and closed it behind him. Watson stood alone in the sitting room for a long time. The fire had burned down to gray ash. Somewhere below, Mrs. Hudson was moving through the hall. A cab clattered past in the street, its driver calling to the horse in the rough, habitual shorthand of men who spend their days negotiating with animals that have long since stopped listening. Watson reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the singed pages. He spread them on the table beside Edwin Cathcart's letter. The name appeared on both, Cathcart, in 2 different hands, linking a dead judge to a detective who had just declared himself deserving of the gallows. Holmes would not speak further today. Watson knew this with certainty. Whatever door had opened long enough to produce that single devastating sentence had already closed, and Holmes would now retreat behind the fortifications of silence and chemical distraction that served him in place of the emotional processing he either could not or would not perform. Very well. Watson would work without him. He took up his pen, drew a fresh sheet of paper from the desk, and began to write down everything Edwin Cathcart had told him. Then he listed what he knew from the burned file's remnants. Then he listed what he did not know, and this second list was very much longer than the first. At the top of the page, he wrote a single question and underlined it. If the right man hanged, why does Holmes believe he should have hanged instead? He did not yet understand that the answer to this question would dismantle nearly everything he believed about the reliability of reason itself. Chapter 2. The Trial That Stopped. The Public Record Office on Chancery Lane admitted Watson at 10 o'clock the following morning with the indifferent efficiency of an institution that has long since ceased to distinguish between those who seek records out of legitimate interest and those who seek them out of desperation. Watson suspected he fell into the latter category, though he had dressed for the former. He had sent a note to Edwin Cathcart requesting the name of the trial, the presiding court, and whatever procedural details Edwin could supply from his own researches. Edwin's reply had arrived by the last post the previous evening, prompt, thorough, and organized, with the methodical instinct of a man trained in the law. Watson carried it in his pocket beside the singed pages and Holmes's letter to the dead judge, and he was aware, as he presented himself at the records desk, that he was assembling a case file of his own from the ruins of the one Holmes had tried to destroy. The clerk who assisted him was a thin, precise man of middle years, whose manner suggested that he regarded every request as a minor imposition upon the natural order of archival silence. Watson gave him the case name, Regina vs. Voss, and the approximate date, and waited while the clerk disappeared into the stacks with the unhurried gait of someone who has confused deliberation with importance. The file, when it arrived, was substantial. The fraud prosecution of Leonard Voss had generated considerable paperwork before its premature termination, and Watson spent the better part of 2 hours working through indictments, depositions, procedural motions, and the dry, relentless language of commercial litigation that made even the most dramatic financial crimes read like disputes over inventory. But the essential facts emerged clearly enough. Leonard Voss had been the principal director of Voss and Hartley Maritime, a shipping firm with roots stretching from Liverpool to Bombay and onward to the South China Sea. The Crown alleged that Voss had systematically defrauded his investors through a scheme of falsified cargo manifests, inflated insurance claims, and phantom shipments, vessels recorded as laden that sailed empty, their supposed cargoes existing only in ledgers designed to extract capital from men who trusted the Voss name. The case had been assigned to Judge Aldous Cathcart of the Queen's Bench. The trial commenced on the 7th of October, 1893, and proceeded through 5 days of prosecution evidence before the recess on the 14th. It was during this recess that Judge Cathcart retired to his private chamber, a small room adjoining the courtroom, accessible by a single door that locked from the inside and was customarily bolted during recesses to ensure the judge's privacy and security. The chamber had one window, but it was barred and overlooked an interior courtyard 4 stories below. The door was the only practical means of entry and exit. At 2:30, when the recess ended and the court prepared to reconvene, the judge did not emerge. The court usher knocked. Receiving no answer, he summoned the chief clerk, who knocked again. After 10 minutes, the door was forced by 2 bailiffs in the presence of the chief clerk and a junior barrister who happened to be passing. They found Judge Cathcart slumped in his chair behind the desk, his wig removed and set aside, his pen still resting between the fingers of his right hand. He appeared to have been writing when death overtook him. The chamber was undisturbed. The bolt was engaged. The window was shut and barred. No other person was present. The court physician, summoned within minutes, pronounced death and attributed it to cardiac failure, a diagnosis that Watson, reading the terse medical report appended to the file, found professionally defensible but conspicuously unquestioning. The physician had noted no signs of violence, no unusual coloration of the skin, no irregularities of the pupils. But neither, Watson observed, had he conducted any toxicological examination. The body had not been opened. No blood had been drawn. The judge was dead, the room was locked, and the conclusion was written before the examination had properly begun. Watson sat back in his chair and considered this. A Queen's Bench judge dies alone in a locked room during the most significant fraud trial on the London calendar. The death is attributed to natural causes without an inquest, without a post-mortem, without so much as a toxicological screen. The trial collapses. The defendant, a man facing ruin and imprisonment, walks free, and no one questions any of it. Watson was not Holmes. He did not possess the deductive machinery that could extrapolate a man's history from the wear on his boot heels or the ink stains on his fingers. But he was a physician, a veteran, and a man who had spent years in the company of the finest analytical mind of the age, and he knew the sound of a thing that did not fit. The absence of an inquest was not an oversight. It was a silence where a sound should have been, and silences of that particular shape were, in Watson's experience, almost always designed. Someone had ensured that Aldous Cathcart's death would be accepted without scrutiny. Someone with sufficient authority or influence to prevent the ordinary mechanisms of judicial accountability from engaging. Watson copied the relevant dates, names, and procedural details into his notebook. He noted the name of the court physician, a Dr. Reginald Morse, since retired, and the names of the bailiffs who had forced the door. He noted that Leonard Voss had been released without conditions after the trial's collapse and that no subsequent prosecution had been initiated. Then he turned to the final document in the file, a brief notation added some months after the trial's termination, recording that the matter of Judge Cathcart's death had been revisited following the arrest of one Arthur Denny in connection with the case. The notation referenced a separate criminal file, Regina vs. Denny, and Watson requested it from the clerk, who received this second imposition upon his archival tranquility with visible displeasure. Watson waited, and while he waited, he wrote in his notebook a single observation that Holmes, he suspected, had arrived at 3 years earlier and had spent every day since trying to unwrite. The locked room was not the mystery. The locked room was the distraction. The real question is why no one looked beyond it. The man who hanged for Leonard Voss. The Denny file was thinner than the Voss file but immeasurably heavier in consequence. Arthur Denny had been 31 years old at the time of his arrest, a shipping clerk of no particular distinction who had worked in the offices of Voss and Hartley Maritime for 6 years before the firm's legal difficulties began. He was unmarried, occupied lodgings in Bermondsey, and had no criminal record. His neighbors, according to the police report, described him as quiet, regular in his habits, and unremarkable in every respect save a fondness for chess, which he played by correspondence with opponents he never met in person. This was the man Holmes had identified as the murderer of a high court judge. Watson read the prosecution's case with the careful attention of a man who knows he is looking for fractures in what others have accepted as solid ground. The Crown's argument rested upon 3 pillars, and Watson recognized each from Holmes's deposition before he reached it: the chemical trace, the forged key, the witnessed argument. These were not the prosecution's discoveries. They were Holmes's, channeled through intermediaries into the hands of Scotland Yard, who had presented them at trial with the confident authority of men who believed they had done the investigative work themselves. The first pillar, a chemical compound identified on the right sleeve of Arthur Denny's overcoat during a search of his lodgings. The compound was described in the analyst's report as a derivative of aconitine, a highly toxic alkaloid extracted from the monkshood plant, capable of inducing cardiac arrest in small doses and notoriously difficult to detect in post-mortem examination, particularly when no post-mortem had been conducted. The presence of this compound on Denny's clothing was presented as evidence that he had handled the poison used to kill Judge Cathcart. The second pillar, a key found in a tobacco tin in Denny's rooms, which matched the lock of the judge's private chamber. The prosecution argued that Denny had obtained an impression of the original key through his connections to the courthouse, connections never specified with precision, and had commissioned a duplicate. This duplicate, the Crown contended, had allowed Denny to enter the chamber, administer the poison, and depart, re-engaging the bolt through a method the prosecution described with conspicuous vagueness as mechanical manipulation from without. The third pillar, the testimony of a court usher named Pelham, who swore that he had witnessed a heated exchange between Arthur Denny and Judge Cathcart in the corridor outside the courtroom 2 days before the death. According to Pelham, Denny had accused the judge of destroying Leonard Voss's livelihood and had made statements that Pelham interpreted as threatening, though he could not recall the precise words. Watson turned to Holmes's deposition. It ran to 9 pages, and it was, Watson had to acknowledge, a masterwork of forensic reasoning. Holmes had not merely presented evidence. He had constructed a narrative so internally coherent, so precisely fitted to the physical facts, that it carried the force of mathematical proof. The chemical trace established means. The forged key established access. The witnessed argument established motive. And Holmes's deductive framework, his reconstruction of the sequence of events, the timing of entry and exit, the method of administering the poison, was presented with a clarity and confidence that Watson could feel even through the dry medium of a legal transcript. He could see how the jury had been persuaded. He could see how any jury would have been persuaded. The case was not merely convincing, it was elegant, and Watson understood, with a discomfort that had been building since the previous night, that elegance was precisely the problem. Holmes's deductions were never wrong in the way that ordinary deductions were wrong, through carelessness, insufficient data, or logical error. When Holmes erred, if he erred, it would be through a flaw in the method itself, an excess of confidence in the purity of physical evidence, a faith that the material world did not lie. Holmes trusted objects the way other men trusted witnesses, absolutely and with the same potential for betrayal. Arthur Denny had been convicted on the 23rd of June, 1894. The jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours. The judge, not Cathcart of course, but a replacement whose name Watson did not recognize, had donned the black cap with what the Times reporter described as evident solemnity. Denny had been hanged at Newgate on the 9th of August. Watson closed the file. He sat for some minutes in the reading room of the Public Record Office, surrounded by the quiet industry of clerks and researchers, the turning of pages, the scratch of pens, the muted institutional hum of a building dedicated to the preservation of the official record. Everything in this building was documented, catalogued, and indexed. Everything was a matter of record. Arthur Denny's trial was a matter of record. His conviction was a matter of record. His execution was a matter of record. And if Holmes was right, if the man who should have hanged was not Denny but Holmes himself, then the record was a lie. And the institution that preserved it was a monument to the lie's permanence. Watson gathered his notes and left the building. On the steps outside, in the pale autumn light, he paused and considered his next movement. He had the 3 pillars of the prosecution's case clearly before him. He needed to test each one independently, not as Holmes had tested them, from the evidence upward, but in the opposite direction, from the conclusion downward, looking not for what the evidence proved, but for what it assumed. He would begin with the chemistry. It was, after all, his own ground. The chemical that was too perfect. Dr. James Holloway occupied a cramped laboratory on the 2nd floor of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, wedged between the dispensary and a supply closet, in a manner that suggested the hospital's administration regarded analytical chemistry as only marginally more important than the storage of surplus bandages. Watson had known Holloway for 15 years. They had trained together briefly before Watson's departure for the Army Medical Service and Holloway's descent into the absorbing, ill-compensated world of toxicological research. Holloway was the kind of man who could identify a poison from the color of a stain on a handkerchief, and who regarded this ability with the same unassuming practicality with which a carpenter might regard his facility with a plane. Watson trusted his competence implicitly and his discretion nearly as much. "Aconitine," Holloway said, reading the analyst's report Watson had copied from the Denny file. He held the paper at arm's length. His eyesight was deteriorating, a fact he refused to address, and frowned at it with professional dissatisfaction. "Yes, the identification is consistent. Aconitine derivative, almost certainly from Aconitum napellus. Monkshood, wolf's bane, if you prefer the theatrical name. It's a perfectly sound choice for a poisoner. Rapid onset, cardiac symptoms easily mistaken for natural failure, and extremely difficult to detect unless you are specifically testing for alkaloids, which nobody did in this case because nobody opened the body." "Could a shipping clerk have obtained it?" Watson asked. Holloway set down the paper. "That depends on what you mean by obtained. Could he have purchased monkshood? Certainly. It grows in half the gardens in England. Could he have extracted a concentrated aconitine derivative of sufficient purity to kill reliably without leaving gross symptoms? No, not without training. The extraction process requires knowledge of alkaloid chemistry that you will not find in a shipping office. You would need access to a properly equipped laboratory and a working familiarity with fractional crystallization techniques. This is not the sort of thing one learns from a household manual. And the compound on the coat sleeve? That is what troubles me most. Holloway reached for the report again and tapped the relevant passage. The analyst describes the residue as a concentrated alkaloid precipitate consistent with aconitine in its crystalline form. Now, Watson, if you were handling a poison with the intention of administering it, would you expect to find crystalline residue on your coat sleeve? Watson considered this. Not if I were careful. Not if you were careful, and not if you were careless either. Crystalline aconitine does not shed. It does not transfer casually to fabric through ordinary handling. If Denny had been preparing a solution, dissolving the crystals for administration, you might find solvent traces, liquid staining, perhaps a faint residue consistent with spillage. But crystalline precipitate on a coat sleeve suggests direct contact with the dry compound in concentrated form, as though someone had pressed the crystals into the fabric. Holloway paused and looked at Watson over the rims of his failing eyes. It suggests, in short, that someone put it there. Watson felt the shift, the quiet, decisive movement of a foundation giving way. He had suspected this. He had come to Holloway expecting this. But suspicion and confirmation are different animals entirely, and the weight of what Holloway was telling him settled into his understanding with the finality of a door closing. The evidence was planted, Watson said. I am telling you that the physical characteristics of the residue, as described in this report, are inconsistent with handling during the preparation or administration of a poison. They are consistent with deliberate application. Someone took crystalline aconitine and pressed it onto that coat sleeve, Watson. Whether they did so to frame this man or for some other purpose, I cannot say. But the chemistry does not support the prosecution's theory of contact through use. Watson thanked Holloway, declined the offer of tea. Holloway's tea was brewed in laboratory glassware and carried a faint but persistent undertone of carbolic, and descended to the street. The first pillar had cracked. Holmes, in 1893, had identified the aconitine residue and drawn the obvious conclusion. The man whose clothing bore the poison's trace was the man who had handled the poison. It was a sound deduction, grounded in physical evidence, and in any ordinary case, it would have been reliable. But the deduction rested on an assumption so fundamental that Holmes would not have thought to question it. The assumption that physical evidence reflects actual events, that the chemical trace arrived on Denny's sleeve through Denny's actions. Someone had understood this assumption. Someone had understood that Holmes, presented with a chemical trace, would reason backward from the trace to the handler and never consider the possibility that the trace itself was a fabrication, a prop placed on a stage for the benefit of an audience of one. Watson hailed a cab and directed it toward Greenwich. The chemical evidence was compromised. The key was next, but Watson was not yet prepared to tackle the locksmith. The third pillar, the witnessed argument, required a living witness, and living witnesses, unlike chemical traces and forged keys, could be questioned, pressed, and broken. He would find the court usher Pelham, and he would ask him not what he had seen, but what he had been told to say. Chapter 3. The Architecture of a Lie. Before Greenwich, there was the matter of the key. Watson changed his plans in the cab, redirecting the driver to Clerkenwell, the old watchmaking district, where locksmiths had clustered for generations among the engravers, jewelers, and instrument makers who gave the neighborhood its particular character of painstaking, ill-rewarded precision. The locksmith whose stamp had appeared on the forged key found in Denny's rooms was recorded in the trial transcript as one Thomas Harker, operating from premises on Seckford Street. Watson had no certainty that Harker still occupied the same address after 3 years, but trades of this kind bred sedentary men, and the cab deposited him before a narrow shop front whose painted sign, T. Harker and Son, Locksmiths, Esther 1862, bore the comfortable dinginess of long establishment. Harker was at his bench, a heavy man of 60 with the enlarged knuckles and contracted pupils of someone who had spent 4 decades performing close work in inadequate light. He regarded Watson's arrival with the wary courtesy of a tradesman who suspects he is about to be asked for credit. Watson introduced himself, mentioned the Denny trial in general terms, and asked whether Harker recalled the commission of the key that had featured in the prosecution's evidence. Harker recalled it vividly. "I recall it because the police came asking, and because I told them the truth then, and I'll tell you the truth now. I made that key, right enough, but it wasn't any Arthur Denny who ordered it." Watson's pencil paused above his notebook. "Who commissioned it?" "A woman. Came in the September before all the trouble. Dressed well, not flashy mind, but good cloth, good cut, the kind of woman who knows what things cost and doesn't mind paying. She brought me an impression in beeswax, very clean, very precise, better than most I see from professionals, let alone civilians. Said she needed a duplicate for a private door in a government building. Said she was a clerk's wife and that her husband had lost his key and would face disciplinary action if the loss were reported." "You believed her?" "I believed her money. She paid in gold, 2 sovereigns for a job worth 4 shillings. I am not a fool, Dr. Watson. I knew the story was thin, but I am a locksmith, not a magistrate. People have their reasons for wanting keys, and most of those reasons are none of my concern." "Can you describe her?" Harker set down the blank he had been filing and gave the question more thought than Watson had expected. "Middling height, dark hair under a good hat, 35, perhaps 40, hard to say precisely. Steady hands. She watched me work, which most customers don't. And she asked questions." "What manner of questions?" "Technical questions. About the lock type. She wanted to know whether it was a lever mechanism or a pin tumbler. And when I told her it was a Chubb detector lock, she nodded as though she already knew and had been testing me. Then she asked about the bolt arrangement, whether the door could be secured from inside with the key removed. I told her it could, if the bolt was a separate mechanism from the lock, which in government buildings it usually is." Watson wrote this down with the particular care of a man who recognizes that he is recording something important without yet understanding its full significance. The woman had known the lock type. She had asked about the bolt arrangement. She had brought a beeswax impression of professional quality. This was not a clerk's wife covering for a lost key. This was someone who understood the architectural security of the building in question, someone who had studied it, planned around it, and arrived at Harker's shop with a specific operational requirement and the resources to fulfill it. "Did you tell the police this?" Watson asked. "About the woman?" Harker's expression shifted. Not guilt, precisely, but the uncomfortable memory of a decision he had been living with. "I told them I made the key. They asked if Denny ordered it. I said I'd never seen the man. They didn't ask further. They had what they wanted." "They didn't ask who did order it?" "They asked if I could identify the customer. I said it was a woman I'd not seen before or since. They wrote it down. Nothing came of it. The key was found in Denny's rooms, and that, it seemed, was evidence enough for everyone." Watson thanked Harker and left the shop. On Seckford Street, amid the quiet industry of craftsmen who made small, precise things for small, precise purposes, he stood for a moment and considered what he had. 2 pillars now, both compromised. The chemical evidence, planted. The key, commissioned by a woman who understood courthouse security with a specificity that implied either professional knowledge or dedicated reconnaissance. The same woman, presumably, in both cases. Someone with chemical expertise sufficient to obtain concentrated aconitine, architectural knowledge of the royal courts of justice, financial resources to pay in gold, and the operational discipline to leave no traceable connection to Arthur Denny. And, Watson was beginning to understand, an intimate familiarity with the way Sherlock Holmes constructed his deductions. Because the evidence had not merely been planted, it had been designed. Each piece addressed a specific requirement of Holmes's analytical method. physical trace for chemical analysis, manufactured object for mechanical reconstruction, human testimony for contextual framing. The three pillars were not random fabrications. They were answers to questions that had not yet been asked, questions the unknown woman knew Holmes would ask, in the order he would ask them, yielding the conclusions she intended him to reach. Watson directed his cab toward Greenwich. One pillar remained. Pelham lived in a terraced cottage near the Greenwich Foot Tunnel, a narrow house wedged between a coal merchant's office and a shop selling nautical instruments that appeared to have last conducted business during the Crimean War. The door was opened by Pelham himself, a man of perhaps 60, stooped, with the careful movements of someone whose joints had begun issuing formal complaints about the terms of their continued service. Watson introduced himself and was admitted to a front parlor that smelled of pipe tobacco and boiled mutton. Pelham did not seem surprised by the visit. He had the resigned air of a man who has been expecting a knock he hoped would never come. "You've come about the Cathcart business," Pelham said, lowering himself into a chair by the unlit fireplace. It was not a question. "I have." 3 years, Pelham said. "I thought perhaps it was done with. I thought perhaps no one would ever come asking again." "Again?" Watson said. "Someone else has asked?" Pelham's hands were trembling. Not the tremor of age. Watson knew that tremor, its rhythm, its mechanical regularity. This was different. This was the tremor of a man whose nervous system was responding to the proximity of something he feared. "No one has asked," Pelham corrected himself too quickly. "I misspoke. I thought no one would come asking at all, after the trial, after the hanging. I thought it was finished." Watson let the correction stand. He would return to it. "Mr. Pelham, you testified at the trial of Arthur Denny that you witnessed an altercation between Denny and Judge Cathcart in the courthouse corridor on the 12th of October, 1893, 2 days before the judge's death." "I did." "I should like you to describe that altercation to me now, as you remember it." Pelham's account came readily, too readily. He described the corridor, the time of day, the position of the two men, the tone of Denny's voice, the expression on the judge's face. He recalled that Denny had been wearing a brown overcoat and that the judge had been carrying a bundle of papers tied with red tape. He remembered that Denny had raised his voice but not his hand, and that the judge had responded with what Pelham described as cold authority before turning away. Watson listened without interrupting. He let Pelham build the scene in its entirety, every detail, every color, every inflection, and when the man had finished, Watson sat in silence for a moment, counting. Pelham had provided 18 specific details about an event 3 years in the past. 18 details delivered without hesitation, without the searching pauses and self-corrections that characterize genuine memory, without the honest imprecision of a man recalling something he witnessed briefly and incidentally while going about his ordinary duties. Real memory was fragmentary. Real memory contained gaps, contradictions, and moments of uncertainty. Pelham's account contained none of these. It was complete, fluent, and theatrically vivid. It was, in short, a performance. And Watson had spent enough years watching Holmes expose performed certainty to recognize it when he encountered it himself. "Mr. Pelham," Watson said carefully, "that is a remarkably detailed recollection of an event that occurred 3 years ago and lasted, by your own account, less than 2 minutes. Pelham's trembling worsened. "You remember the color of Denny's overcoat? You remember red tape on the judge's papers? You remember the precise tone of voice and the specific words used? And you have delivered this account without a single moment of doubt or revision." "I have a good memory." "You have an excellent memory for this particular event, Mr. Pelham. An extraordinary memory. The kind of memory that, in my professional experience, people possess only for events that have been rehearsed." The silence that followed was of a different quality than any Watson had experienced during this investigation. It was not the calculating silence of Holmes or the guarded silence of a man with something to protect. It was the silence of collapse, the moment when a structure that has been holding through force of will alone recognizes that the will has given out. "She came to me," Pelham said. His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "Before the trial, months before, a woman, well-dressed, well-spoken, calm as you please. She sat in this very room, in that chair you're sitting in, and she told me what I was to say. What you were to say about the argument between Denny and the judge." "There was no argument." Pelham's eyes were fixed on the cold grate. "I never saw Arthur Denny speak to Judge Cathcart. Not once, not ever. I don't know that the man even knew what the judge looked like. The woman, she gave me every detail. The corridor, the time, what they were wearing, what was said. She made me repeat it back to her until I had it right, until it sounded natural." "And you agreed to this?" "She offered money, £20. I'm not a wealthy man, Dr. Watson. I was a court usher, earning less than a shop clerk. £20 was more than I earned in 3 months. Pelham's voice carried the particular flatness of a confession that has been rehearsed internally 1,000 times without ever being spoken aloud. "And she did not only offer, she made it clear that the alternative to cooperation was not simply the absence of money. She knew things about me, about a debt I owed, about a situation with a woman in Deptford that my wife did not know about. She was very calm about it, very precise. She said I would testify as instructed, and that if I did, the money would come and the other matters would remain private. And if I did not—" He stopped. Watson did not press him to continue. The shape of the coercion was clear enough. "Did you see her again, after you agreed?" "Once. She came back to hear me recite it a final time, the week before the trial. She said it was satisfactory. She left the £20 in an envelope on that table. I never saw her again." "Can you describe her?" Pelham's description matched Harker's in its essentials. Middling height, dark hair, well-dressed, steady-mannered, somewhere between 35 and 40. A woman of composure and resources, operating with a systematic thoroughness that Watson was beginning to find not merely alarming but architectural. She had designed the crime the way an engineer designs a bridge. Every component calculated, every stress anticipated, every load distributed precisely across the points that would bear it. Watson rose. "Mr. Pelham, you understand that your testimony sent an innocent man to the gallows." Pelham did not look up. "I understand it, Dr. Watson. I have understood it every day for 3 years. Do you think a night has passed when I have not understood it?" Watson left the cottage without offering the man absolution. He had none to give, and the giving of it was not, in any case, his office. Pelham would live with what he had done, and the £20, long since spent, would purchase no remedy for the particular kind of damage that accrues to a man who knows he helped kill a stranger for money and convenience. On the street outside, Watson consulted his notebook. 3 pillars, all 3 shattered. The chemical evidence, planted by someone with advanced toxicological knowledge. The key, commissioned by a woman who understood courthouse architecture. The testimony, purchased through bribery and coercion from a man too weak and too compromised to refuse. Arthur Denny had been framed with meticulous, systematic precision, and the frame had been constructed not merely to convince a jury but to convince Sherlock Holmes. Every piece of evidence had been calibrated to Holmes's specific analytical methods, placed where Holmes would find it, shaped to produce exactly the deductive chain that Holmes would construct. Holmes had not been deceived. He had been used. Watson returned to Baker Street with a weight in his chest that had nothing to do with exertion. The deduction that devoured itself. Holmes was in the sitting room when Watson arrived, seated at the deal table with a rack of test tubes before him. The tubes contained solutions of varying color: amber, pale green, a deep arterial red, and Holmes was adding drops from a pipette to the nearest tube with the focused attention of a man engaged in work that mattered. Watson knew it did not matter. The experiment was a barricade. He removed his coat, set his notebook on the desk, and sat down in his usual chair. He did not speak immediately. He allowed Holmes the dignity of completing his current titration, watching the solution in the tube shift from amber to a clouded yellow before he began. The chemical evidence was planted. The aconitine was pressed onto Denny's sleeve in crystalline form, inconsistent with handling during preparation or administration. Dr. Holloway at Bart's confirmed this within minutes of seeing the analyst's description. Holmes's pipette hovered above the next tube. A single drop fell. He did not look up. The key was commissioned by a woman. Thomas Harker, the locksmith on Seckford Street, remembers her clearly. She brought a professional quality beeswax impression, paid in gold, and asked technical questions about Chubb detector locks and bolt mechanisms. She knew the courthouse architecture. The police never followed up on Harker's statement that the customer was female. They had Denny's name and Denny's lodgings, and that sufficed. Holmes set down the pipette. He did not reach for another instrument. His hands rested on the table still, and Watson could see in their stillness not calm, but the conscious suppression of movement, the physical correlate of a man holding himself in place by deliberate effort. The witnessed argument never happened. Pelham, the court usher, was bribed and coerced by the same woman. £20 and the threat of personal exposure. He memorized a script. He performed it at trial. He has been living with the knowledge of what he did for 3 years, and he is, I should say, not living well? Watson paused. The room was quiet. From the street below, the sounds of Baker Street's evening commerce filtered upward. Hooves on cobblestones, the call of a newsboy, the distant mechanical groan of an omnibus. All 3 pillars of your case against Arthur Denny were fabricated, Watson said. Every piece of evidence you gathered was placed for you to find, constructed to match your methods, designed to produce exactly the conclusion you reached. You were not investigating a crime, Holmes. You were reading a text that someone had written for you. Holmes raised his head. The expression Watson saw was not the one he had expected. He had anticipated defensiveness, perhaps, or the cold, analytical detachment Holmes deployed when emotion threatened to compromise his reasoning. He found neither. Holmes's face held something Watson could only describe as recognition, the look of a man hearing spoken aloud what he has long known in silence. Yes, Holmes said. The word was unadorned. No qualification, no caveat, no attempt to soften or contextualize. Just the bare, blunt monosyllable of a man who has stopped pretending. You know, Watson said, it was not a question. I have known for approximately 2 years. I confirmed it 18 months ago through an independent investigation I conducted without your knowledge. A circumstance for which I offer no apology, as the investigation concerned my own culpability, and I did not consider it appropriate to involve you in the assessment of my failures. Your failures. Watson leaned forward. Holmes, a man was hanged. I am aware of what was done to Arthur Denny. What was done? What you did to Arthur Denny. Your deposition was the centerpiece of the prosecution, your analysis, your certainty. The jury convicted on your word. On my reasoning, Holmes corrected, and for the first time there was an edge in his voice, not anger at Watson, but something directed inward. A blade turned against the hand that held it. My reasoning was flawless, Watson. Every logical step I took was sound. Every inference followed from the evidence before me with mechanical precision. I did not err in my logic. I erred in my faith that the evidence was genuine, that the physical world had not been stage-managed for my benefit, that the things I observed were the things that had actually occurred. He stood, moved to the window, and looked out into the street. Not performing contemplation, Watson could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid set of his spine. Holmes was not arranging his thoughts for presentation. He was enduring them. "I was the murder weapon," Holmes said quietly. "Not the poison, not the key, not the perjured testimony. Those were components. I was the mechanism that assembled them into a conviction. Whoever designed this, and I know who designed it, understood that my deductive method, applied to carefully constructed false evidence, would produce a result indistinguishable from genuine forensic analysis. They understood that a jury would not question my conclusions. Because my conclusions had never been wrong, they used my reputation as the final element of the frame." Watson sat with this. He had known it, intellectually, since his conversation with Holloway. But hearing Holmes articulate it, hearing the precise, relentless mind that had solved 1,000 cases describe itself as an instrument of injustice, produced a sensation Watson had no adequate name for. It was not pity. Holmes would not have tolerated pity. It was something closer to vertigo. The disorientation of discovering that the foundation you have trusted is not bedrock but scaffolding, and that the scaffolding can be built by other hands. "Who?" Watson said. Holmes turned from the window. "Her name is Elise Voss. She is Leonard Voss's wife. She was educated in chemistry at the University of Zurich, one of the few European institutions that admitted women to scientific study. She is intelligent, methodical, and possessed of a particular talent that I have encountered in no other adversary, which is, she understands systems, not merely chemical systems or mechanical systems, but cognitive systems. She studied my published methods, your accounts, Watson, and the technical monographs I have contributed to various journals, and she reverse-engineered my analytical process. She identified the sequence in which I evaluate evidence, the weight I assign to physical traces versus testimony, the assumptions I make about the integrity of the material world. And she built a crime scene that was, in every respect, a perfect answer to the questions she knew I would ask." Holmes's voice was level, but Watson could hear beneath it the residue of something that was not admiration, and was not fear, and was not quite anger. It was the sound of a man confronting the discovery that his greatest strength, the quality that defined him, that gave his existence its purpose and its shape, was also, under the right conditions, his most exploitable weakness. "She did not defeat me," Holmes said. "She did something far more dangerous. She made me defeat myself." Watson looked at his friend, at the sharp, drawn face, the restless hands now still at his sides, the gray eyes that had seen through 10,000 deceptions and had failed to see through this one, and understood, for the first time, why Holmes had been burning the file. It was not the case he wanted to forget. It was the version of himself that the case revealed. Chapter 4. The Woman Who Understood the Machine. Watson did not sleep that night. The question that kept him from rest was not the one Holmes had answered. The identity of the architect, the method of the frame, the mechanism by which an innocent man had been fed to the gallows through the machinery of Holmes's own brilliance, but the one Holmes had not. He asked it over breakfast, which Holmes attended with the mechanical motions of a man performing a social obligation from which all meaning had been drained. Toast, tea, the knife drawn across butter with geometric precision. Watson watched these movements and recognized them as the residue of discipline in a mind that had lost its footing. "Why didn't you expose her?" Holmes set down his cup. "I beg your pardon?" "Elise Voss. You identified her 18 months ago. You confirmed that Denny was framed, that the evidence was fabricated, that the woman who commissioned the key and bribed the witness and planted the chemical trace was the wife of the man whose trial the murder was designed to collapse. You had the truth. Why did you not bring it forward? To whom? To Scotland Yard, to the Home Office, to anyone with the authority to act upon it." Holmes looked at Watson with an expression that was neither condescending nor defensive. It was tired. Watson had seen Holmes exhausted by cases, depleted by cocaine, diminished by boredom. He had never seen him tired in this particular way, the fatigue of a man who has carried a weight he cannot set down because the ground on which he might place it does not exist. In 1893, Holmes began, the use of forensic deduction in English criminal proceedings was in its infancy. My own work, our work, Watson, for your published accounts contributed materially to the public's understanding, had played a significant role in establishing the credibility of analytical methods in court. Judges were beginning to accept deductive testimony. Juries were beginning to trust physical evidence interpreted through systematic reasoning. The Denny conviction was, in the eyes of the legal establishment, a vindication of this approach. It demonstrated that scientific analysis could identify a killer where conventional police methods had failed. And if I had come forward, if I had announced that the physical evidence in the Denny case had been fabricated, that my deductive analysis had been manipulated, that the conviction was the product not of forensic insight, but of a designed deception, what do you suppose would have followed? Watson opened his mouth and then closed it. He saw it. He saw it as Holmes had seen it, and the seeing was like stepping to the edge of a precipice and looking down. Every conviction obtained through similar methods would have been challenged, Watson said slowly. Every case in which forensic deduction had contributed to a guilty verdict. Every case, not merely mine, Watson. Every case in which any analyst had provided deductive testimony. The precedent would have been established that physical evidence could be manufactured to exploit analytical methods, and that even the most rigorous forensic reasoning could produce false convictions. Defense counsel across England would have seized upon it. Appeals would have been filed by the dozen. Men who were genuinely guilty, men I had helped convict through legitimate analysis of legitimate evidence, would have had grounds to demand new trials. Holmes rose from the table and moved to the mantelpiece, where he stood with his back to Watson in a posture that was not theatrical but simply weary. I performed a calculation, he said. One innocent man, already dead, whose name I could not restore without destroying the evidentiary framework that had convicted 30 or 40 guilty ones. One miscarriage of justice, weighed against the potential release of men I knew to be murderers, poisoners, forgers, and thieves. I chose the system over the individual. I chose to let Arthur Denny remain guilty in the eyes of the law, so that the law's capacity to convict the actually guilty would not be undermined. Watson stared at Holmes's back. The morning light from the window fell across the room in pale bands, illuminating the chemical apparatus on the deal table, the scattered papers, the ordinary domestic clutter of a life built around extraordinary work. All of it looked different now. All of it looked like the visible surface of a mechanism whose hidden gears were lubricated with compromise. You made that decision alone, Watson said. Who else was there to make it? That is not what I mean, and you know it. You made that decision without consultation, without oversight, without submitting it to anyone whose judgment might have differed from your own. You appointed yourself the arbiter of a question that affects the entire administration of criminal justice in this country, and you decided, alone, in secret, without accountability, that the system mattered more than the man it had wrongfully killed. Holmes turned. Yes. And you see nothing troubling in that? I see everything troubling in it, Watson. I have seen everything troubling in it for 18 months. That is why I was burning the file. Not because I wished to escape the truth, but because I wished to ensure that no one else would be forced to confront the same impossible calculation and arrive, as I did, at an answer that is logically defensible and morally repugnant. Watson pushed his plate aside. His appetite was gone, replaced by something that sat in his chest like ballast, heavy, cold, and load-bearing. He was angry at Holmes. He was angry in the specific, painful way that one is angry at someone whose reasoning one cannot refute, but whose conclusions one cannot accept. What happened to Elise Voss? Watson asked. She disappeared. After Voss's release, The trial was never reconvened. Without the judge, the prosecution lost its momentum, and the Crown declined to proceed. The Voss household was quietly dissolved. Leonard Voss relocated his business interests to the continent. Elise Voss vanished. I spent 4 months attempting to trace her and failed. She understood counter-surveillance as well as she understood chemistry and courthouse architecture. She had planned her disappearance with the same systematic thoroughness she had applied to everything else. And now? Edwin Cathcart has found you. He is asking questions you have spent 3 years avoiding. What has changed? Holmes was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried an undertone Watson had not heard before, something that, in a man less rigorously self-controlled, might have been called apprehension. I received a communication 10 days ago, unsigned, delivered by common post. It contained a single line. The son has the letter. It begins again. Watson felt the temperature of the room change, not literally, but in the way that a space changes when the nature of the threat within it shifts from past to present. Someone informed you that Edwin Cathcart had found Holmes's letter to his father. Someone who knew about the letter, knew about Edwin, and knew that his discovery would bring him to Baker Street. Yes, Elise Voss? I do not know. That is what frightens me, Watson, if that word is not too dramatic for your taste. I do not know whether this communication came from Elise Voss, or from someone connected to her, or from someone else entirely. I do not know whether Edwin Cathcart's arrival is the organic consequence of a son discovering his mother's hidden correspondence, or whether it is the opening movement of something designed, as the original crime was designed, to exploit the predictable responses of predictable people. Holmes met Watson's eyes. I burned the file because I did not want it to be available if someone came looking. I was not hiding the past. I was trying to prevent the past from being weaponized. Again, Watson spent the afternoon at the reading room of the British Museum, pursuing a line of inquiry that Holmes, characteristically, had already exhausted, but that Watson wished to verify independently. Trust, once fractured, demanded its own repairs, and Watson was not prepared to accept Holmes's account of Elise Voss without confirming as much as the public record would yield. The record yielded more than he had expected. Elise Marguerite Tourneau had been born in Lausanne in 1856, the daughter of a French-speaking Swiss chemist who held a minor professorship at the Cantonal University. She had been educated first at home. Her father, by the accounts Watson found referenced in a Swiss scientific periodical held in the museum's foreign collection, had been an advocate of women's scientific education at a time when such advocacy carried professional risk, and subsequently at the University of Zurich, where she had studied analytical chemistry with a focus on alkaloid compounds and their pharmacological properties. She had published 2 papers before the age of 25. The first concerned the crystallization behavior of aconitine derivatives under varying temperature conditions. The second addressed methods for detecting alkaloid residues on fabric, specifically the conditions under which such residues would and would not transfer through ordinary contact. Watson read this second paper twice. It was precisely the knowledge that had been deployed against Arthur Denny. Elise Voss had not merely understood the chemistry of the poison, she had published research on the forensic detection of its traces. She knew how aconitine behaved on fabric because she had studied it experimentally. She knew that crystalline residue on a coat sleeve would be interpreted as evidence of handling because she understood the assumptions forensic analysts would bring to such a finding. And she knew, because her own research demonstrated it, that those assumptions were wrong under specific circumstances. She had used her own published science as the blueprint for a fabrication. Watson set down the periodical and sat for some minutes amid the vast, productive silence of the reading room, where scholars pursued knowledge with the focused absorption of men who believed that understanding the world was an unqualified good. He wondered, briefly, whether Elise Voss had once sat in a room much like this one, pursuing the same belief before the world had given her reasons to turn her knowledge to other purposes. The marriage to Leonard Voss had taken place in 1882 in London. Watson found the record in the Civil Registry Index. Leonard Voss was 20 years her senior, a self-made man whose shipping fortune had been assembled through methods that, Watson suspected, would not have survived close scrutiny even before the fraud charges. The marriage appeared to have been strategic on both sides. Voss gained a wife of education and continental polish. Elise gained access to wealth and the social infrastructure of London's commercial class. Holmes had described her as someone who understood systems. Watson was beginning to appreciate the breadth of that understanding. She had navigated the system of Swiss higher education at a time when it barely admitted women. She had navigated the social system of London's merchant elite through a calculated marriage. She had navigated the legal system of England by identifying its structural dependence on a single analytical mind and turning that dependence into a weapon. And she had navigated Holmes. This was the element Watson found most difficult to assimilate. Holmes's published methods, the monographs on tobacco ash, on typefaces, on the tracing of footsteps, on the interpretation of physical evidence, were publicly available. Anyone could read them. But reading them and understanding them well enough to construct a false evidence landscape that would survive Holmes's analysis were entirely different achievements. It required not merely comprehension of the techniques, but an intuitive grasp of the mind that deployed them, the sequence of attention, the hierarchy of significance, the assumptions so deeply embedded in the analytical framework that Holmes himself did not examine them. Elise Voss had studied Holmes the way Holmes studied crime scenes, systematically, empirically, and with the patient, dispassionate rigor of a scientist isolating variables. She had identified his patterns. She had mapped his cognitive architecture, and she had built, within that architecture, a structure that looked like truth from every angle Holmes knew how to examine. Watson returned to Baker Street with his notes and a growing conviction that the woman they were dealing with was not merely clever, not merely dangerous, but something rarer and more unsettling. She was Holmes's methodological equal operating in a domain Holmes had never thought to defend, the domain of his own predictability. Holmes was waiting. He had abandoned the pretense of chemical experimentation and was sitting in his chair with the concentrated stillness of a man who has stopped running from something and is now simply facing it. "You've been to the British Museum," Holmes said. "It was not a deduction, it was a recognition. You found her published work." "I did. She wrote a paper on alkaloid residue transfer to fabric. She knew Holmes. She knew that crystalline aconitine on a coat sleeve would be misread as evidence of handling because she had studied the conditions under which such a misreading would occur. She built the frame on the foundation of her own scientific research." "Yes." Holmes's voice was flat. "She is, in every meaningful sense, a forensic scientist of considerable ability who chose to apply her expertise not to the detection of crime, but to its architecture. She did not improvise, Watson. She engineered. And she engineered you as well." Holmes did not flinch, but Watson saw the micro-movement in his jaw, the suppression of a response that would have cost something to speak aloud. "She understood that I would approach the Cathcart death as a sealed room problem," Holmes said. "She understood that I would seek physical evidence first, testimony second, and motive third. She understood that I would weight material traces above witness statements and that I would trust the chemical evidence most heavily because chemistry does not lie, or so I believed. She constructed a sequence of discoveries calibrated to my investigative rhythm, and she placed at the center of that sequence a man, Arthur Denny, whose proximity to Leonard Voss provided a plausible connective tissue that my deductive method would naturally seize upon." "You are describing yourself as a mechanism. I am describing what she saw when she looked at me. Not a man, not an intellect. A system with known inputs, predictable processes, and reliable outputs. She did not need to deceive me in the conventional sense. She needed only to provide the correct inputs, and the system produced the output she required. Watson absorbed this. It was, he recognized, the most nakedly self-critical statement he had ever heard Holmes make. Not a performance of humility, but a genuine reckoning with a limitation Holmes had not previously believed he possessed. The great detective was not infallible. He was, under specific conditions, programmable. "There is one thing I still do not understand," Watson said. "Why has Edwin Cathcart surfaced now? If his mother hid the letter for 3 years, and she has only recently died, is this simply the natural consequence of an estate being settled? Or is there design in the timing?" Holmes looked at him. "That is precisely the question I have been unable to answer. And it is precisely the question that determines whether we are investigating a historical crime or walking into a current one." The son's inheritance. Watson met Edwin Cathcart the following afternoon at a tea room on the Strand, a neutral ground chosen by Watson to avoid the charged atmosphere of Baker Street, where Holmes's presence would have introduced complexities Watson was not yet prepared to manage. He needed to speak to Edwin without Holmes's analytical shadow falling across the conversation, because what Watson intended to tell the young man would require emotional space that Holmes's proximity would compress. Edwin arrived punctually. He was dressed as before, carefully, professionally, with the disciplined presentation of a man for whom appearance was both armor and advertisement. He sat across from Watson, ordered tea he did not drink, and waited with the particular patience of someone who has learned to endure waiting as a professional skill. "Mr. Cathcart," Watson began, "I have spent the past 3 days investigating the circumstances of your father's death. I have examined the trial records, consulted with a toxicologist, re-interviewed the locksmith who made the key found in Arthur Denny's lodgings, and spoken at length with the court usher whose testimony was central to Denny's conviction." Edwin's hands were on the table, one resting atop the other. They did not move. "Your father was murdered. On that point, I can confirm your suspicion without reservation. The official attribution of cardiac failure was incorrect. He was poisoned, almost certainly with an aconitine derivative, administered by a method I have not yet been able to reconstruct fully in his locked chamber during the trial recess. And Arthur Denny?" Watson held Edwin's gaze. "Arthur Denny did not kill your father. The evidence against him was fabricated. All of it. The chemical trace, the key, the witnessed argument. Every element was manufactured and planted by someone who understood forensic analysis well enough to construct a false evidence trail that would withstand expert examination." Watson paused, because what came next would land harder. "Mr. Holmes investigated your father's death in 1893 and reached the conclusion that Denny was guilty. His analysis was the foundation of the prosecution's case. His deposition was the centerpiece of the trial, and his analysis was wrong, not because his reasoning was faulty, but because the evidence he relied upon was deliberately designed to produce the conclusion he reached. Mr. Holmes was, in effect, manipulated into convicting an innocent man." Edwin Cathcart sat very still. The tea room's ambient noise, the clink of porcelain, the murmur of conversation, the measured tread of waiters, continued around them with the indifferent persistence of a world that does not pause for personal catastrophe. "Holmes knows this," Edwin said. "Not a question. He has known for approximately 18 months. He confirmed the fabrication through independent investigation. He identified the person responsible." "Who?" "Elise Voss, the wife of Leonard Voss, the man your father was trying when he died." Watson watched the name land. He watched Edwin process it, watched the young solicitor's trained mind seize the implications, organize them, and arrive at the conclusions they demanded with a speed that spoke well of his legal acuity and poorly of his emotional resilience. "She killed my father to save her husband from conviction. That appears to be the case. And she framed Denny to provide an alternative culprit." Yes. And Holmes identified Denny, testified against him, and secured his conviction and execution. Yes. And then Holmes discovered the truth and did nothing. This was the moment Watson had dreaded. Not the revelation of the murder, not the exposure of the frame, but this, the point at which Edwin's understanding would shift from the historical facts of the case to the moral facts of Holmes's subsequent silence. Watson could see it happening in real time, the tightening of Edwin's jaw, the subtle recession of color from his face, the transformation of shock into something colder and more architecturally sound. He did nothing, Edwin repeated. He discovered that an innocent man had been hanged on his testimony, and he chose to say nothing, to do nothing. My father's killer walked free, and Holmes allowed it. He believed, Watson began. I do not care what he believed. Edwin's voice did not rise. That was the frightening thing about it. The anger was not hot. It was structural, load-bearing, the kind of anger that does not dissipate because it has become part of the framework within which the person organizes their understanding of the world. My father is dead. An innocent man was hanged, and the man whose word condemned that innocent man decided, on his own authority, that the truth was less important than his reputation and the reputation of his methods. Watson considered correcting this characterization. Holmes's reasoning had been consequentialist, not self-serving. He had weighed systemic stability against individual justice, not his own reputation against Denny's life. But Watson recognized that the distinction, while intellectually valid, was emotionally meaningless to a man sitting across a tea table, being told that his father's murder had been not merely unsolved, but actively concealed by the one person with the power to expose it. Mr. Cathcart, Watson said quietly, I am not here to defend Holmes's decision. I am here because you deserve the truth, and because I believe the truth still has the capacity to produce consequences, even at this late stage. Edwin looked at him. The anger was still there. Watson could see it in the set of his shoulders, the pressure of his fingers against the tablecloth. But something else was emerging alongside it. Purpose, direction, the focused energy of a man who has been groping in darkness and has found, if not light, then at least a wall to push against. I have found her, Edwin said. Watson blinked. I beg your pardon? Elise Voss. I have been looking for her for 2 months, since I found the letter. I did not know her connection to the case until you told me just now, but I knew the name Voss from my father's trial records, and I knew the wife had disappeared. I hired an inquiry agent. He located her 3 weeks ago. Where? Stepney. She is living under the name Ellen Vane in a boarding house on Salmon Lane. She works as a seamstress. She has been there for over a year. Watson sat with this information and felt the case shift beneath him, its center of gravity moving from the past toward the present with a momentum he was not certain he could control. I intend to confront her, Edwin said. And I want Holmes there when I do, not as an investigator, not as an ally, as a witness. I want him to see what his silence has allowed to persist. A woman who murdered a judge and destroyed an innocent man, living quietly in Stepney, sewing hems, untouched by consequence. Watson thought of Holmes in the sitting room, hands spread on the mantelpiece, describing himself as a mechanism that had been exploited. He thought of the burning file, the unsigned note, the question of whether Edwin's arrival was organic or orchestrated, and he thought of Elise Voss in a boarding house in Stepney, the architect of a perfect crime, reduced to needlework and anonymity, waiting perhaps for exactly this. I will speak to Holmes, Watson said. Chapter 5. The Woman in the Ordinary Room. They went the following morning, the three of them, in a four-wheeler that Holmes hailed on Baker Street, with the brisk authority of a man who has made a decision and intends to execute it before his reservations can organize a counter-argument. Edwin Cathcart sat opposite, his face set, his hands resting on the document case he carried on his lap with the protective intensity of a man transporting something volatile. Watson, between them, occupied the uncomfortable middle ground, physically and, he suspected, morally. Holmes had agreed to the confrontation with less resistance than Watson had anticipated. There had been no argument, no negotiation, no elaborate weighing of tactical considerations. Holmes had simply listened to Watson's account of the tea-room conversation, asked 3 questions: the address in Stepney, the name Elise was using, and how long Edwin's inquiry agent had been watching her, and said, "Tomorrow morning, early." The cab crossed the city eastward through streets that changed character by the quarter mile, the commercial bustle of the city giving way to the denser, darker textures of Whitechapel, and then to the particular atmosphere of Stepney, where the dock's influence permeated everything. The smell of the river, the sound of maritime commerce conducted at volume, the transient population of men who worked the water and lived on whatever margin the water allowed. Salmon Lane was a narrow street of terraced houses and small commercial premises, unremarkable in every respect. The boarding house was identifiable only by a card in the ground floor window advertising rooms to let. There was no name on the door. The paint was peeling. A cat sat on the front step with the territorial composure of an animal that has claimed this territory by default rather than contest. Edwin moved to exit the cab first. Holmes placed a hand on his arm. "Mr. Cathcart, when we enter, you will allow me to speak first. You will not make accusations. You will not produce documents. You will observe, and you will wait. If she is what I believe her to be, she will respond more fully to the appearance of control than to the reality of confrontation. Do you understand?" Edwin stiffened. Watson could see the objection forming. Who are you to dictate terms? You who concealed the truth for 3 years. But Edwin mastered it. He was, Watson reflected, his father's son in at least this respect, capable of subordinating personal feeling to strategic judgment when the stakes warranted it. They entered the boarding house through an unlocked front door that opened onto a cramped hallway smelling of carbolic and boiled cabbage. The landlady, a stout woman with the harried efficiency of someone managing too many tenants with too few resources, directed them to the second floor after Holmes presented his card and requested Mrs. Ellen Vane. "She's in," the landlady said with a glance at the 3 men that combined curiosity with the practiced disinterest of someone who has learned not to inquire too deeply into her tenants' affairs. "Second door on the left. She's usually sewing at this hour." They climbed a narrow staircase. The second-floor corridor was dim, lit by a single window at its far end that admitted a gray, filtered light. Holmes knocked on the second door. "Come in." The voice was calm, unperturbed. The voice of a woman who was expecting a knock, though perhaps not this particular one. Holmes opened the door. The room was small, 10 feet by 12, Watson estimated, with a single window overlooking a yard where laundry hung in limp rows. A narrow bed occupied one wall. A table stood beneath the window, covered with fabric, scissors, thread, and the paraphernalia of plain sewing. A woman sat at the table with a half-finished garment in her lap and a needle between her fingers. She was perhaps 40, as Harker and Pelham had estimated. Her hair was dark, drawn back simply. Her face was composed, regular, without distinction. The kind of face that could pass through a crowd without snagging a single memory. She wore a plain gray dress. Her hands were steady. She looked at Holmes, then at Watson, then at Edwin. Her gaze returned to Holmes and remained there. "Mr. Holmes," she said. She set down the needle. She did not stand. "You're late." The words dropped into the small room with the weight of a verdict. Watson felt them land, felt their implications settle into the space between the 3 men and the woman at the table. She had been waiting. Not in the theatrical sense of a villain anticipating a final act, but in the practical, unglamorous sense of a woman who had calculated a probability and found it confirmed. She had expected Holmes to come. She had expected it years ago. His lateness was not dramatic. It was data. Another piece of evidence in her ongoing assessment of his predictability. Holmes stepped into the room. Watson and Edwin followed. The space was insufficient for 4 people and the history they carried, and the walls seemed to contract around the weight of it. "Mrs. Voss," Holmes said. "That name belongs to another life. But yes, sit if you can find a place. I'm afraid I was not expecting company, though I suppose I was expecting you." There were 2 chairs besides the one she occupied. Holmes took one. Watson took the other. Edwin remained standing, his back against the closed door, the document case held before him like a shield. Elise Voss, Ellen Vane, Mrs. whatever she chose to be, looked at Edwin with an expression that Watson could not immediately categorize. It was not guilt. It was not defiance. It was something more complex. The look of a woman regarding the consequences of her actions in their living, breathing, human form. "You are the son," she said. "I am," Edwin said. She nodded. Once. Then she turned back to Holmes. "Ask your questions, Mr. Holmes. I have been sewing hems for 3 years. I would welcome the change of occupation." The confession, that was an accusation. Holmes did not begin with questions. He began with silence, not the theatrical, self-indulgent silence that Watson had been forbidden to expect by the very nature of this encounter, but a brief, tactical pause during which Watson watched Holmes study the room with the rapid, all-encompassing attention that was his fundamental mode of engagement with the world. Watson saw him register the sewing materials, the quality of the fabric, the precision of the stitching on the garment in progress. He saw him note the books on the shelf above the bed. 3 volumes, their spines too distant to read from where Watson sat, but apparently legible to Holmes. He saw him observe the single personal item in the room, a small framed photograph on the windowsill, too far away and too angled for Watson to make out its subject. Then Holmes spoke. "You killed Judge Cathcart with aconitine administered through the ink in his pen. The compound was introduced into the reservoir in a concentrated solution that would have been absorbed through the skin of his fingers during writing. Onset would have occurred within 20 to 30 minutes. The symptoms, numbness, cardiac irregularity, respiratory failure, would have been consistent with the cardiac event the court physician diagnosed. You prepared the pen in advance and substituted it for his own during a recess on the 13th, the day before his death, knowing he would use it the following day during the trial proceedings." Elise Voss listened to this with the attentive stillness of a student hearing a professor deliver a lecture she has already read. When Holmes finished, she inclined her head. "The pen, yes. I am impressed it took you so long to determine the method, given that the judge was found with the pen in his hand. But I suppose you were not looking for the method in 1893. You were looking for the man, and I had already provided one." "You provided everything," Holmes said. "The chemical trace, the key, the witness. You built a case the way one builds a clock. Each component machined to specification, each interaction calibrated, the whole mechanism designed to produce one specific output. And the output was you, Mr. Holmes. Your certainty, your testimony, your unimpeachable reputation applied to evidence I had constructed for the express purpose of being subjected to your analysis. I did not need to deceive a jury. I needed only to deceive you. The jury would follow where you led, because you had never led them wrong. Until then. She folded her hands in her lap. The gesture was composed, almost prim. The gesture of a woman who has arranged the terms of a conversation and is prepared to conduct it on those terms. "Shall I tell you why?" "I know why. Your husband was being prosecuted for fraud. Cathcart was the presiding judge. His death collapsed the trial. That is the mechanism. I asked if you wished to know the reason." Holmes said nothing. Watson, watching from the second chair, understood that the silence was not refusal but permission. Holmes ceding the floor to a woman whose perspective he had never heard and whose motives he had, perhaps, never fully considered. Aldous Cathcart was a corrupt judge, Elise said. The words were delivered without heat, without indignation, with the flat precision of a woman stating a chemical formula. He had been accepting payments from commercial interests for at least 7 years, payments that influenced his rulings, his scheduling, his procedural decisions. My husband's trial was not the product of legitimate prosecution. It was the product of a bribe. Watson straightened. Beside him, he heard Edwin's breathing change. A sharp, involuntary intake, the physiological marker of a shock the body registers before the mind can process it. A competitor of my husband, a man named Rawlinson, who operated a rival shipping line and who stood to absorb my husband's routes and contracts in the event of his conviction, had been paying Cathcart for 2 years. The fraud charges against Leonard were not fabricated entirely, but they were selectively constructed. Certain irregularities that were common practice across the entire shipping industry were isolated, reframed, and presented as evidence of systematic criminality, while identical practices by Rawlinson's firm were ignored. Cathcart ensured the case went forward. Cathcart ensured the jury pool was drawn from districts sympathetic to Rawlinson's interests. Cathcart ensured that defense motions were denied and prosecution motions granted with a consistency that should have been visible to anyone who cared to look. "These are accusations," Holmes said. "Have you evidence?" Elise Voss looked at him with something Watson might have called disappointment, if the word were not too mild. "Mr. Holmes, I am a chemist. I do not make assertions without evidence. I documented every payment. I traced every transaction. I have a ledger, dates, amounts, intermediaries, corresponding judicial decisions. I kept it because I am not a fool, and because I understood that evidence is the only currency that retains its value over time." "And Arthur Denny?" Watson interjected. Elise turned to him. Her expression shifted, not dramatically, not with the theatricality of a woman performing a revelation, but with the subtle recalibration of someone adjusting the terms of a conversation to include a new interlocutor. "Arthur Denny," she said, "was Cathcart's bagman." The room contracted around the word. Watson felt Edwin flinch behind him. A physical movement, involuntary. The response of a body absorbing an impact the mind has not yet catalogued. "Denny collected the payments," Elise continued. "He was the intermediary between Rawlinson and Cathcart. He handled the money, arranged the meetings, and maintained a separate set of records that Cathcart could deny knowledge of in the event of exposure. Denny was not an innocent man, Dr. Watson. He was complicit in the corruption that was destroying my husband. He was complicit in the perversion of a trial that should never have been brought. He facilitated bribery, obstructed justice, and profited from both." "He did not kill your father's judge," Watson said. "He did not deserve to hang for murder." "No," Elise said. "He deserved to hang for corruption. But corruption does not carry a capital sentence in this country. Murder does. I made a practical decision. Denny was guilty, not of what I arranged for him to be convicted of, but guilty nonetheless. He was not an innocent man destroyed by an arbitrary frame. He was a guilty man punished for the wrong crime." Watson looked at Holmes. Holmes's expression had not changed. That rigid, analytical mask was in place, the face he wore when processing information whose emotional implications he was not yet prepared to address. But Watson knew Holmes well enough to read the minute signs, the tension at the corners of the mouth, the stillness of the hands, the particular quality of attention that indicated not calm, but the active suppression of its opposite. "You are asking us to accept," Holmes said slowly, "that the murder of a corrupt judge and the framing of his corrupt intermediary constitute a form of justice. I am asking you to accept that the system of justice in which you place such touching faith had already failed. It had failed my husband. It had failed every litigant who appeared before Cathcart's bench and received a verdict calibrated not to the evidence, but to the payments. I did not subvert justice, Mr. Holmes. I operated in the space where justice had already ceased to function, and you used me to do it. I used the tools that were available. You were the most effective tool. The word hung in the room. Tool. Watson watched it register on Holmes's face, a flicker, quickly suppressed, that spoke to the particular humiliation of a man who prides himself on his agency being told by the person who exploited him most completely that his agency was never the relevant variable. Edwin had not spoken since Elise's revelation about his father. Watson turned to look at him and found a young man in the process of disassembling everything he had believed about his own history. Edwin's face was pale, his lips pressed together, his eyes fixed on Elise Voss with an expression that contained no single identifiable emotion, but rather a compound of several: grief, fury, disbelief, and beneath them all, the terrible dawning recognition that the father he had come to avenge might not have been the man he had believed him to be. Elise looked at Edwin. Her composure held, but Watson detected beneath it, with the diagnostic instinct that was his own form of expertise, something that was not quite remorse, but was adjacent to it. An awareness of cost. A recognition that the young man standing against the door was a consequence she had calculated but perhaps not fully imagined. "You have his eyes," she said to Edwin. "I am sorry for that." What the sun cannot bear. Edwin Cathcart did not move for nearly a full minute after Elise Voss spoke. Watson counted the seconds, a physician's habit, born of years measuring pulse rates and respiratory intervals, and watched the young solicitor's composure undergo a series of visible stresses, each one producing a micro-adjustment in posture, expression, and breathing that together constituted a portrait of a man holding himself together through an act of will that was rapidly approaching its structural limit. "You are lying," Edwin said. Elise did not react to this. She remained in her chair with her hands folded, her expression neither challenging nor sympathetic, simply present in the way that a fact is present. "My father was a Queen's Bench judge. He served for 19 years. He was respected by his colleagues, admired by the bar, and mourned, genuinely mourned, by the legal community when he died. You are a convicted murderer's wife living in a boarding house in Stepney, and you expect me to accept your word that he was corrupt?" "I expect you to examine the evidence," Elise said, "as your father's profession would have demanded, and as Mr. Holmes's certainly does." "What evidence?" Elise rose from her chair, the first time she had stood since their arrival, and moved to the bed. From beneath the mattress she withdrew a bound ledger, perhaps 8 inches by 12, its cover plain brown leather, its edges worn by handling. She carried it to the table and set it down atop the sewing materials with the careful deliberation of a woman placing a capstone. "Dates," she said, "amounts, names of intermediaries, corresponding judicial decisions. 7 years of documentation, Mr. Cathcart. Your father's entire career on the bench, annotated in a level of detail that would satisfy any forensic accountant in England." Edwin looked at the ledger. He did not reach for it. "I kept it as insurance," Elise continued, "against the possibility that I might one day need to explain myself. To the police, to a court, or to someone like you. I had hoped it would not be necessary. I had hoped that Mr. Holmes's silence would extend indefinitely and that the past would remain where I left it. But here we are." "Open it," Holmes said to Edwin. His voice was quiet and carried none of the commanding authority Watson associated with Holmes's usual directives. It was closer to a request, and closer still to an act of care, though Watson doubted Holmes would have recognized it as such. Edwin opened the ledger. The first page bore a date, 12th of March, 1886, and beneath it in a small, precise hand that was neither Elise's nor the judge's, a record, Rawlinson to A.C., via Denny, $200. Rescheduling of Hendon Freight Limited. Postponement of hearing to allow restructuring of plaintiff's claim. Below this entry, A second column recorded the corresponding judicial action. Hearing postponed 18th of March. Plaintiff's motion to restructure granted 22 March. Edwin turned the page. Another date, another payment, another judicial decision that aligned with mechanical precision to the money that preceded it. He turned another page, and another. Watson watched Edwin's hands as he moved through the ledger, watched the fingers that had been steady throughout their tea-room conversation begin to betray a tremor that was not merely physical, but seemed to originate in some deeper stratum of the young man's constitution, as though the foundations upon which his understanding of his father, his family, and his own purpose had been built, were shifting beneath him in real time. By the 10th page, Edwin's face had changed. The anger was still present, but had been joined by something else. Something Watson recognized from his medical practice. From the moments when a patient receives a diagnosis, they have privately suspected, but publicly denied. The recognition that the truth one has been fleeing is the truth one has already, in some unacknowledged chamber of the mind, accepted. "Watson," Holmes said, "examine the ledger." Watson moved to the table and looked over Edwin's shoulder. The entries were methodical, consistent, and bore the hallmarks of genuine record-keeping rather than fabrication. The handwriting was uniform throughout, the same intermediary hand, presumably Denny's, recording each transaction with the bureaucratic regularity of a clerk performing a routine function. The amounts were plausible, large enough to constitute meaningful bribes, but not so large as to strain credulity. The corresponding judicial actions were specific, verifiable, and covered a range of case types: scheduling changes, procedural rulings, evidentiary exclusions, sentencing recommendations. "This would need to be verified against court records," Watson said. "The dates, the rulings, the cases referenced, all of it can be checked." "It can," Elise said, "and it will hold. I did not fabricate this ledger, Dr. Watson. I did not need to. The corruption was real. The documentation is genuine. It was kept by Arthur Denny as a record of services rendered, and I obtained it from his lodgings before the police searched them, along with the key impression and the knowledge of where Denny kept his overcoat." Edwin closed the ledger. His hands lay flat upon its cover, pressing down, as though the weight of his palms could somehow contain or compress the implications of what lay within. Watson saw the young man's throat work, a swallowing motion, convulsive, repeated, and understood that Edwin was fighting something more powerful than grief, more disorienting than anger. He was fighting the dissolution of a narrative that had given his life its shape and direction for 3 years. He had come to Baker Street seeking justice for a murdered father. He was holding in his hands the evidence that his father had been a man whose murder, while criminal, had been committed in response to genuine and sustained corruption. The quest had not merely failed, it had inverted. The hero of Edwin's story had become something else entirely, and Edwin, dutiful, precise, determined Edwin, was now holding the document that accomplished the transformation. He did not release the ledger. His fingers remained pressed against the leather, white-knuckled, as though by maintaining physical contact with the evidence he could somehow maintain his relationship to the version of his father that the evidence destroyed. Holmes reached across the table and placed his hand on the ledger, not pulling it away but resting his hand beside Edwin's on the same surface, sharing the weight. "Mr. Cathcart," Holmes said, "we will verify every entry in this ledger independently, every date, every amount, every judicial decision. You will not be asked to accept any conclusion on trust, not on this woman's trust, and not on mine. The evidence will be examined, and the evidence will determine what is true." Edwin looked up. His eyes were bright with moisture he had not shed, and clearly did not intend to shed. Not here, not in this room, not in the presence of the woman who had killed his father and the man who had failed to bring her to justice. "Take it," Edwin said. His voice was hoarse. "Take it and verify it, and then tell me what is left." Holmes lifted the ledger from the table with both hands. He held it for a moment, not examining it, not performing analysis, simply holding it. And Watson saw in the gesture something he would not have expected from Holmes and could not entirely explain. It was not tenderness, and it was not sympathy, and it was not the clinical handling of an evidentiary object. It was something closer to the careful way a man handles a thing he knows to be both fragile and dangerous, a thing that can illuminate and destroy in the same moment. They left the boarding house in Stepney without further words to Elise Voss. She did not see them out. She returned to her sewing, and the last image Watson had of her was a woman in a gray dress in a small room, drawing thread through fabric with the steady hands of someone who has long since made peace with what those hands have done.
Chapter 6. The Ledger and the Law. Holmes worked for 2 days without rest, and Watson, who had witnessed many such episodes of sustained analytical effort and had long since abandoned the pretense that medical advice would be heeded, worked alongside him. They divided the labor along lines that reflected their respective competencies. Holmes took the financial trail, bank records accessible through his network of contacts in the city, shipping manifests obtained through a customs house clerk who owed Holmes a favor of unspecified but apparently considerable magnitude, and a series of private communications with a retired chancery barrister whose knowledge of commercial litigation in the early 1890s was encyclopedic. Watson took the judicial record. Court schedules, published rulings, procedural orders, the public paper trail of Judge Cathcart's 19 years on the Queen's Bench. The ledger held. Entry by entry, date by date, the corroboration accumulated with the relentless momentum of a tide coming in. The payments recorded in Denny's careful hand corresponded to verifiable banking transactions. Deposits into an account held under a name that was not Cathcart's, but that Holmes traced through 2 intermediary accounts to a trust fund administered by a solicitor who had since died, and whose records had passed to a firm that, by remarkable coincidence, had been retained by Rawlinson's shipping company. The judicial decisions aligned. Watson compiled a chronology of Cathcart's rulings in cases connected to Rawlinson's interests, and found a pattern so consistent it approached the mathematical. In 11 separate matters over 7 years, Cathcart had ruled in favor of positions that benefited Rawlinson or disadvantaged his competitors. Scheduling delays, evidentiary exclusions, procedural rulings that narrowed the scope of cross-examination, each one defensible in isolation, each one devastating in aggregate. 3 other cases bore the same signature. Watson found them by working outward from the ledger's entries into the broader body of Cathcart's judicial output, looking for the same pattern of anomalous rulings aligned with external interests. In 2 of these cases, the litigants who benefited had connections to Rawlinson that were discoverable through company registries. In the 3rd, the connection was less direct, but no less suggestive. A property dispute in which Cathcart's ruling had cleared the way for a dock expansion that subsequently increased the capacity of a warehouse leased by Rawlinson's firm. Arthur Denny's name appeared as intermediary in 11 of the documented transactions. His role was consistent throughout. He received payments from Rawlinson's agents, retained a commission of roughly 10%, and delivered the balance to an address in Holborn that Holmes identified as the office of the trust fund administrator. Denny's function was mechanical, clerical, and essential. Without him, the system of payments would have required direct contact between Rawlinson and Cathcart, a risk neither man was prepared to take. Watson set down his pen at the end of the 2nd day and looked at the evidence spread across the sitting room table. It was comprehensive, cross-referenced, and damning. Judge Aldous Cathcart had been corrupt. Arthur Denny had been his willing instrument, and Elise Voss, whatever else she was, murderer, manipulator, architect of a miscarriage of justice, had been telling the truth about the world in which she had operated. Holmes stood at the window, looking out into Baker Street. His reflection was visible in the glass. A gaunt, angular figure superimposed upon the street below, transparent, occupying 2 spaces at once. Watson thought, not for the first time during this investigation, that this double image captured something essential about their current predicament. The visible world and the hidden world, overlaid, inseparable, each one altering the meaning of the other. "It is all true," Watson said. "Yes. Cathcart was corrupt. Denny was complicit. Elise Voss killed a man who was perverting the justice system and framed a man who was helping him do it. Those are the facts. And your deduction, convicted a guilty man for the wrong crime." Holmes turned from the window. His face was drawn, the skin tight across the bones, in the way Watson associated with prolonged deprivation of food, of sleep, of the sustaining fiction that the world was amenable to rational correction. An innocent man, in the eyes of the law, Watson. Denny was never charged with corruption. He was never investigated for his role in the bribery scheme. He was charged with murder, convicted on fabricated evidence, and executed. The fact that he was guilty of other crimes does not legitimize the process by which he was condemned. A man hanged for the wrong reason is still wrongly hanged. Watson could not argue with this. It was precisely the kind of moral clarity Holmes was capable of producing when the subject was abstract, and precisely the kind of moral clarity that had failed him when the subject was his own complicity. "What do we do now?" Watson asked. Holmes looked at the ledger, the notes, the accumulated evidence of corruption and counter-corruption, of systems designed to produce justice and systems designed to exploit their failures. "I do not know," he said, and Watson believed him.
The argument began as the worst arguments do in a space too small to contain it. They had left Baker Street for the Strand, intending to call upon the retired Chancery barrister who had assisted Holmes with the financial verification, a final consultation to confirm certain details before Holmes determined his course of action. Watson had hailed a four-wheeler, and they were seated opposite each other in the cab's dim interior, the ledger between them on the seat like a territorial boundary, when Watson said the thing he had been composing in his mind for 2 days. "You must go to the authorities." Holmes, who had been watching the street through the window with the abstracted attention of a man whose thoughts were elsewhere, turned to look at Watson. "Must I?" "The Home Office, the Lord Chancellor's office, Scotland Yard if necessary, though I would prefer a higher authority. You must present the evidence, all of it, the corruption, the fabrication, the wrongful conviction. Denny's name must be cleared, Cathcart's corruption must be exposed, and Elise Voss must face whatever legal consequence the evidence supports." "And what legal consequence would that be, Watson? Consider carefully before you answer. Elise Voss killed a corrupt judge and framed his corrupt intermediary using evidence that was examined and accepted by the finest forensic mind in England. If I go to the authorities, I must explain not only what she did, but how she did it, which means explaining that my analytical methods can be exploited by anyone who studies them with sufficient care. I must demonstrate, publicly and on the record, that forensic deduction is vulnerable to designed fabrication. You explained this reasoning before. I was not persuaded then, and I am not persuaded now. I am not attempting to persuade you. I am attempting to make you see the consequences." "I see the consequences." Watson's voice had risen. He brought it down with effort, conscious of the cabman on the box above them. "I see a man who was hanged for a crime he did not commit. I see a woman who committed murder and walked free. I see a corrupt judge whose corruption was never exposed, and I see you, sitting in this cab, holding the evidence that could address every one of these injustices, and calculating reasons not to use it. I am calculating costs, Watson. That is not the same thing." "It is the same thing. It is exactly the same thing. You are weighing Arthur Denny's life against the inconvenience that disclosure would cause to you and to the system you have built your reputation upon. You did this 3 years ago, and a man remained wrongly convicted. You are doing it again now, and you expect me to sit here and nod along as though the calculus has changed." The cab jolted over a rut. The ledger slid on the seat between them. Neither man reached for it. "The calculus has not changed," Holmes said. "That is precisely the problem. Disclosure today produces the same consequences it would have produced 3 years ago. Every conviction based on forensic deduction becomes appealable. Every guilty man I have helped put away gains grounds for a new trial. The criminal justice system's capacity to prosecute using scientific evidence is undermined, not for a year or a decade, but permanently. Elise Voss demonstrated that the method can be exploited. If that demonstration becomes public, it will be exploited again by defense counsel, by guilty men, by anyone with an interest in discrediting forensic testimony. And so Arthur Denny remains a convicted murderer. Arthur Denny is dead, Watson. He has been dead for 2 years. Nothing I do now can restore his life. It can restore his name, at the cost of releasing men who are alive and guilty and dangerous. Watson stared at Holmes across the narrow space of the cab. The city moved past the windows, buildings, pedestrians, the ceaseless mechanical life of London, and none of it touched the interior of their argument, which had achieved the hermetic intensity of a sealed room. "You are doing it again," Watson said. "Doing what?" "Arrogating to yourself the authority to make a decision that is not yours to make. You are one man, Holmes. One man with one mind, however extraordinary that mind may be. You do not have the right to decide, alone and in secret, that the integrity of a system matters more than justice for the individuals that system has failed. That is not detection. That is not reason. That is the same species of unaccountable authority you have spent your career opposing in others." The words landed. Watson saw them land, saw something move behind Holmes's eyes that was not anger and was not concession, but was, perhaps, the recognition that a blow had struck home. "You accuse me of repeating my original error," Holmes said, "because you are repeating it. The original error was not the deduction. The original error was the silence afterward, the decision to protect the system at the expense of the truth. You are sitting in this cab right now preparing to make that same decision again, and I am telling you, as your friend, as your colleague, as the man who has chronicled your work for a decade, and who has never once questioned your judgment until this week, that it is wrong." Holmes was silent. The cab moved through traffic, slowing, stopping, starting again with the lurching rhythm of London's congested arteries. "What would you have me do?" Holmes said at last. "That does not create another Arthur Denny?" Watson opened his mouth. No words came. The question was precise, surgical, and unanswerable, and Holmes had delivered it not with triumph, but with genuine inquiry, as though he hoped Watson might have an answer he had not been able to find. Watson did not have an answer, not yet, not one that satisfied the question's demands. They rode the rest of the way in silence, not the contemplative silence of men who have reached understanding, but the charged, unresolved silence of men who have reached the limit of what words can accomplish and must now sit with the insufficiency. The cab deposited them at Baker Street. They had never reached the Strand. Chapter 7. The Weight of What Remains. 3 days passed before Holmes acted. Watson did not press him during this interval. There was nothing to be gained by repetition. The argument in the cab had said everything both men were capable of saying, and what remained was not a matter of persuasion, but of decision. A decision that belonged to Holmes, however strenuously Watson might dispute the terms on which Holmes claimed ownership of it. Holmes spent those 3 days in a state Watson had not previously witnessed. It was not the black lethargy that followed periods of inactivity, nor the manic energy that accompanied active investigation. It was something more akin to the focused, painful deliberation of a man working through an equation whose solution he suspects will be unwelcome, but whose mathematics he cannot avoid. On the morning of the 4th day, Watson descended to find Holmes at the desk. He was writing, not notes, not chemical formulae, not the terse, abbreviated memoranda that characterized his casework. He was writing a letter in his best hand, on good paper, with the slow, considered attention of a man choosing each word as though it carried physical weight. Watson sat in his chair and waited. Holmes wrote for 40 minutes. He did not pause, did not cross out, did not crumple and restart. The letter emerged complete, as though he had composed it entirely in his mind during the 3 days of silence, and was now merely transcribing. When he finished, he set down his pen, folded the letter, and placed it in an envelope. He addressed it to Edwin Cathcart at the Chancery Lane chambers Edwin had provided on his card. Then he held it out to Watson. "Read it," Holmes said, "before I send it." Watson took the letter and read it standing by the window in the morning light. "Dear Mr. Cathcart, I write to you in full knowledge that nothing in this letter will be adequate to the harm in which I have been complicit, and I do not offer it as remedy. There is no remedy. I offer it as record, a complete and honest account of what occurred, what I did, what I failed to do, and what the evidence now demonstrates. Your father, Judge Aldous Cathcart, was murdered on the 14th of October, 1893, by means of aconitine administered through the ink reservoir of his pen. The murderer was Elise Voss, wife of Leonard Voss, whose fraud trial your father was presiding over at the time of his death. Elise Voss committed this act in the belief, now substantiated by documentary evidence I have independently verified, that your father was corrupt. A ledger maintained by Arthur Denny, your father's intermediary, records 7 years of payments from a commercial rival of Leonard Voss, payments that correspond to judicial decisions favorable to the rival's interests and unfavorable to your father's duty. I have verified these records against court documents, banking transactions, and commercial registries. The corruption was real, sustained, and systematic. Arthur Denny was complicit in it. This does not justify murder. It does not excuse Elise Voss, and it does not alter the central fact of my involvement, that in 1893 I investigated your father's death, identified Arthur Denny as the murderer on the basis of evidence that had been fabricated by Elise Voss to exploit my analytical methods, and provided testimony that led to Denny's conviction and execution for a crime he did not commit. I discovered the truth approximately 18 months ago. I did not disclose it. I persuaded myself that disclosure would cause greater harm than silence, that revealing the vulnerability of forensic deduction to deliberate exploitation would undermine the system of justice more broadly and potentially free guilty men convicted through legitimate analysis. This reasoning was not without foundation, but it was not mine to apply. I appointed myself the arbiter of a question that affected your life, Denny's memory, the integrity of the courts, and the public trust, and I decided it alone, in secret, without accountability. I will not repeat that error. Enclosed with this letter you will find the verified ledger, my complete notes on both the original investigation and the subsequent verification, and a summary of the evidence regarding Elise Voss's method and motive. I am placing this material in your hands without recommendation or instruction. You are the person most directly affected by these events. You are a solicitor trained in the law and capable of assessing the legal and personal implications of disclosure. The decision of what to do with this evidence, whether to pursue prosecution, seek posthumous exoneration for Denny, expose the corruption, or do nothing, belongs to you. I do not ask your forgiveness. I have not earned it, and the asking would be self-serving. I ask only that you make your decision with the full body of evidence before you, which is the single thing I should have ensured 3 years ago and did not. Sherlock Holmes. Watson folded the letter and replaced it in the envelope. He looked at Holmes, who sat at the desk with his hands resting on its surface, palms down, in the posture of a man who has set something heavy upon a table and is feeling for the first time the relief of his unburdened arms. "It is honest," Watson said. "It is overdue. Those are not mutually exclusive." Holmes almost smiled. Not quite. The muscles engaged, the intention formed, but it did not complete itself. It was the ghost of a smile, the acknowledgement of a bond that had survived a test neither man had anticipated. "Send it," Watson said. Holmes rang for Mrs. Hudson. What Elise Voss chose. Watson went alone to Stepney. He did not tell Holmes, not from secrecy. The days of concealment between them were, he hoped, concluded, but from a conviction that this particular visit required his presence unaccompanied. Holmes had written his letter. Holmes had made his reckoning. But there remained a conversation that was Watson's to have in his own capacity, with his own authority, and he did not wish Holmes's shadow, however diminished, however chastened, to fall across it. The boarding house on Salmon Lane was as he had left it. The same peeling paint. The same territorial cat, now dozing on the step in a patch of thin sunlight. The landlady admitted him without comment, and directed him upstairs with a jerk of her head that constituted, by Stepney standards, a warm welcome. Elise Voss was sewing. The same chair, the same table, the same gray dress. The half-finished garment had progressed since their last visit. Watson could see that the bodice was now nearly complete, the stitching small and even, the work of hands that found in repetitive precision a form of equilibrium. She looked up when Watson entered, and her expression underwent a change so subtle that only a man trained in the observation of physiological affect would have caught it. It was not surprise. It was assessment. A rapid, comprehensive evaluation of Watson's presence, his posture, his unaccompanied state, and the implications of all three. Dr. Watson, without Mr. Holmes, that is interesting. I did not come to discuss Holmes. And yet he is the reason you are here. Watson sat in the chair he had occupied before. The room was exactly as small as he remembered, and the accumulated weight of what had happened within its walls made it feel smaller still. Holmes has written to Edwin Cathcart. He has provided the full evidence, the ledger, his notes, the verification. He has given Edwin the authority to decide what happens next. Elise set down her needle. Given him the authority, as though it were Mr. Holmes's to give, as opposed to withholding it, which is what he did for 3 years. I take your point, Mrs. Voss, but the gesture is genuine, however imperfect. Gestures are always imperfect, Dr. Watson. That is what makes them gestures rather than actions. Watson studied her. In the light from the window, she looked older than she had during the confrontation, not aged, but weathered, like a structure that has withstood pressure for so long that the pressure has become part of its form. She was not a woman diminished by her circumstances. She was a woman who had arranged her diminishment as deliberately as she had arranged everything else. The modest room, the assumed name, the honest work that bore no resemblance to the extraordinary capabilities it concealed. I came to tell you that Holmes understood, Watson said. What you showed him, about his method, about its vulnerability, about the way certainty can be manufactured and fed to a mind that trusts its own processes above all else. He understood it. Elise looked at him for a long moment. Did he understand, Dr. Watson, or did he merely comprehend? They are different things. Comprehension is intellectual. Understanding requires something Mr. Holmes has spent his life avoiding. And what is that? The acceptance that intelligence is not a moral quality, that being right, even genuinely right, even brilliantly right, does not make one good. Your friend has built his life on the premise that the correct application of reason produces just outcomes. I showed him that it does not. That reason, applied to a corrupted landscape, produces corrupted outcomes, with the same mechanical reliability it produces true ones. The method does not distinguish. The method cannot distinguish. And a man who trusts his method absolutely is a man who can be absolutely controlled by anyone who controls the inputs. Watson absorbed this. It was, he recognized, the most complete articulation of the case's central lesson, delivered not by Holmes, who was too close to it, and not by Watson, who lacked the analytical vocabulary, but by the woman who had designed the demonstration. He understood, Watson said again. I believe he understood. Elise picked up her needle. She held it between her fingers, that small, bright instrument, and looked at it as though it reminded her of something. Understanding changes nothing, she said. The judge is still dead. Denny is still hanged. Your friend's reputation will survive, as reputations do, because the world prefers its heroes intact. And I am still here, sewing hems in Stepney, because the system that my husband's rivals corrupted and that your friend's methods failed to correct cannot afford to acknowledge that any of this happened. You will not be arrested, Watson said. He did not frame it as a question because it was not one. He had worked through the legal realities with the same thoroughness he had applied to the medical evidence, and the conclusion was inescapable. Prosecuting Elise Voss for the murder of Judge Cathcart would require exposing the corruption, the fabricated evidence, the wrongful conviction, Holmes's role, and the systemic failures that had enabled all of it. No prosecutor would bring that case. No government would permit it. No, Elise said. I will not be arrested. That is not justice, Dr. Watson. It is architecture. The building cannot remove a load-bearing wall without risking collapse, and so the wall remains, cracked, compromised, but standing. I am that wall. Mr. Holmes is that wall. The entire edifice of forensic jurisprudence in England is that wall. She threaded her needle and bent to her work. Thank you for coming, Dr. Watson. You are a kinder man than your friend, though I suspect you know that. Give Mr. Holmes my regards. Tell him I expected better of him. Not in 1893. In 1893, he performed exactly as I predicted. But afterward, the silence, the suppression, the utilitarian arithmetic, that disappointed me. I had hoped he would be brave enough to accept the consequences of being wrong. It appears that even the finest minds have their limits. Watson rose. There was nothing more to say, nothing that would alter the positions they held or dissolve the moral complexities that bound them. Elise Voss had committed murder. She had framed a man for it. She had used Holmes as her instrument. And she had been right about the corruption, right about the system's failure, right about the vulnerability of reason to manipulation. She was guilty and correct simultaneously, and the law, that blunt, necessary, insufficient instrument, could not hold both of these truths at once. Watson left the boarding house. On Salmon Lane, the ordinary life of Stepney continued around him. Costermongers calling their wares, children running between carts, a dog barking at a horse that ignored it with professional disdain. The world was functioning. The world always functioned. It was only when you looked at the machinery behind the function that you saw the cracks. The page Watson kept. Baker Street, when Watson returned, was occupied by the sounds of industry. Holmes was at the deal table, bent over a rack of test tubes containing solutions that bore no relation to anything Watson had seen during the past week's investigation. The chemical apparatus was freshly arranged, new reagents, clean glassware, a Bunsen burner whose flame cast a small, steady light across the table's surface. Holmes was working with the focused, deliberate movements of a man who has decided to move forward, and is doing so with the particular intensity of someone who knows that forward is the only direction available. He did not look up when Watson entered. This was not the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of resumed activity, the sound of a mind re-engaging with the world's problems after a period of enforced confrontation with its own. Holmes was not pretending the past week had not occurred. He was choosing, with the conscious determination that characterized his every significant decision, to continue. Watson hung his coat. He stood for a moment in the sitting room, looking at the familiar disorder, the papers, the equipment, the books stacked on every surface, the bullet holes in the wall, the accumulated evidence of a life lived in relentless pursuit of a principle that had proven this week to be both indispensable and insufficient. He crossed to his desk. He sat down. He opened the drawer and withdrew his journal, the private record he kept separate from the published accounts, the repository for cases too sensitive, too personal, or too morally complex for the reading public. He had not written in it for some months. The last entry concerned a matter of no particular consequence, and Watson noted, with the detached self-awareness of a man observing his own patterns, that he had written at length about trivial cases and not at all about significant ones. He opened the journal to a fresh page. He took from his breast pocket the singed pages he had rescued from the fireplace, the fragments that had started everything, the pieces Holmes had tried to destroy. He unfolded them and smoothed them flat against the journal's open page. The name Cathcart was still legible. The partial chemical formula, the aconitine derivative that Elise Voss had used, had published research on, had turned from a subject of scientific inquiry into an instrument of murder, was still visible along the scorched margin. The handwritten instruction, "The verdict stands. Let it stand," remained in its unknown hand, as clear and damning as the day it was written. Watson laid the pages inside the journal. He did not tape them in or affix them with any permanence. He simply placed them there between the blank page and the written one, where they would remain unless someone came looking. He picked up his pen. He held it above the page for a long time. The instinct to write was powerful. The chronicler's compulsion, the physician's habit of documentation, the friend's desire to make sense of what had happened by rendering it in narrative form. He had spent a decade transforming Holmes's cases into stories, shaping the raw material of investigation into prose that served the dual purpose of entertainment and record. His pen had always been the instrument of this transformation. His pen had always been sufficient. It was not sufficient now. He could not write this case, not because it was too complex or too sensitive or too damaging to Holmes's reputation, though it was all of these things. He could not write it because writing it would require him to choose a frame, and every frame available was a distortion. If he wrote it as a story of Holmes's failure, he would reduce a genuine moral catastrophe to a narrative of individual fallibility. If he wrote it as a story of systemic corruption, he would obscure the human cost, Arthur Denny's death, Edwin Cathcart's shattered inheritance, Elise Voss's cold and justified fury. If he wrote it as a story of justice, he would be lying, because justice had not been served and could not be served, and the word itself had been emptied of its meaning by the events he would be describing. He could not write it, and so he did not. He closed the journal with the pages inside it and returned it to the drawer. The evidence was preserved. The story was not told. These two facts would coexist in the drawer of his desk, in the silence of his discretion, for as long as he chose to maintain them. It was not Holmes's silence. Watson was clear on this distinction, and the distinction mattered to him in ways he suspected he would spend years attempting to articulate. Holmes had suppressed the truth out of calculation, a weighing of consequences, a rational assessment of costs and benefits, performed by a single mind operating without oversight or accountability. Watson was withholding the narrative out of something different. Not calculation, but recognition. Recognition that some truths, when rendered into story, become smaller than themselves. Recognition that Edwin Cathcart, who now held the evidence and the authority to act upon it, deserved to make his choices without the pressure of public narrative shaping the terrain. Recognition that Elise Voss, guilty, brilliant, unrepentant, and unreachable by law, existed in a moral space that Watson's prose could describe but not resolve. And recognition, finally, that mercy was not the same as silence, even when it looked identical from the outside. Holmes's silence had been strategic. Watson's silence was an act of care, imperfect, arguable, and his own. At the deal table, Holmes adjusted his Bunsen flame and reached for a fresh pipette. The experiment continued. Whatever it was, whatever problem had presented itself, whatever question demanded the application of that extraordinary, fallible, indispensable mind, Holmes was pursuing it with the unsentimental focus of a man who has looked at his own limitations and decided not to transcend them, but to work within their boundaries. Watson watched him for a moment. The distance between them was the width of a sitting room. 12 feet of carpet, cluttered furniture, and shared history. It was also the width of a revelation that had altered the terms of their partnership without dissolving it. They would not speak of this case again. Watson knew this as certainly as he knew the anatomy of the human hand or the dosage tables he had memorized at Netley. The case would sit in his journal, in Holmes's memory, in Edwin Cathcart's hands, and in a small room in Stepney where a woman sewed hems with fingers that had once built a machine out of a detective's certainty and watched it consume an innocent man. Watson turned to his desk and began, for no reason he could have satisfactorily explained, to write a letter to an old friend from his army days, a man he had not contacted in years, a man who knew nothing of Holmes or detection or the terrible arithmetic of justice. He wrote about the weather. He wrote about his practice. He wrote about a book he had recently read and found disappointing. He wrote about ordinary things, because ordinary things were what remained when the extraordinary had passed through and left its damage. Behind him, Holmes worked on. The afternoon light moved across the room. The page sat in the drawer.